Mrs. Walker, you are under arrest for financial crimes. Laura didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply looked at the handcuffs closing around her wrists and said in a voice so quiet the nurse beside her had to lean in to hear it, "My husband's surgery is in 3 days." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The hallway of St. Vincent's Hospital went completely still, and in that silence, something irreversible began. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and follow every part until the end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning of Friday, September 14th, began the way most mornings began, in room 214 of St. Vincent's Medical Center, with Ethan Walker lying in a hospital bed staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until Monday. 3 days. That was all he had left to wait. 3 days until the surgical team of Dr. Raymond Holloway would go into an attempt to give him back something that had been stolen from him 4 years ago, the ability to walk across a room without his legs threatening to collapse beneath him. Ethan was 46 years old, and he had not walked normally since the night a drunk driver crossed the center line on Route 9 and took away the next decade of his life in approximately 3 seconds. The accident had not killed him. People always said that like it was the good news. And maybe it was, but the surgeons who worked on him that night in the emergency room told his wife in careful clinical language that the damage to his lower spine was severe and that full recovery was unlikely. They used words like degenerative progression and long-term mobility challenges, and what those words meant in practical human terms was this Ethan Walker, who had spent his adult life moving on motorcycles on job sites through the rooms of people who needed help, was now mostly confined to a bed, a wheelchair, in the particular private hell of watching his own body fail him one day at a time. Laura had never accepted that verdict. Not in year 1 when the insurance company denied their first appeal. Not in year 2 when 2 separate surgical consultants told them the procedure was too risky, given Ethan's specific spinal profile. Not in year 3 when the medical bills accumulated into a number so large that Laura had started writing it down on a piece of paper just so she could look at it without flinching, because she believed the way some people believe in gravity, that a problem you could look at directly was a problem you could eventually solve. And in year 4, she had solved it. Dr. Raymond Holloway at St. Vincent's had reviewed Ethan's imaging and told them something the other doctors hadn't, that new surgical techniques had changed the risk calculus significantly, that the window for meaningful intervention was still open, and that if they could move forward within the next 6 months, he believed Ethan had a real chance at recovering a substantial portion of his mobility. Define substantial, Laura had said, because she was a nurse and she knew that word carried a lot of weight and sometimes not much meaning. Dr. Holloway had looked at her evenly and said, walking to your car, walking to the grocery store, walking beside your husband without worrying he'll fall. Laura had pressed her lips together and nodded very carefully, and then she had gone to the hospital parking lot and sat in her car for 11 minutes and cried harder than she had since the night of the accident. Because she wanted that. She wanted that so much it was difficult to breathe around. The surgery cost $94,000. Their insurance covered 60% after deductibles, which left a gap of approximately $38,000, a number that sat between Ethan and his recovery like a locked door. Laura had been building the fund for 14 months. She had not built it alone. The Hells Angels chapter based out of Bridgeport, Connecticut was not what most people imagined when they heard that name. Laura had learned this the hard way, or rather the slow way, or over 7 years of being married to a man who had grown up riding with those men who trusted them with the kind of unquestioning certainty most people reserved for family, and who had tried to explain them to her in the early years of their marriage with varying degrees of success. They're just people, Ethan used to say, which was both entirely true and almost useless as a description. Because yes, they were people, but they were a specific kind of people, the kind who showed up when other people didn't. The kind who fixed a widow's roof without being asked and then left before she could thank them. The kind who drove 4 hours to sit with a dying man they'd met once at a rally because someone said he had no family coming. The kind who passed the hat for a child's medical bills without making a single speech about it. Who funded Christmas dinners for families who were too proud to go to shelters. Who quietly, consistently, without fanfare or expectation, did the work that most people only talked about doing. Laura had been skeptical at first. She was a nurse. She was practical. She believed in documentation and evidence and the careful verification of claims. The leather jackets and the reputation and the stories she'd grown up hearing, all of it had made her cautious. But caution applied long enough to the right evidence eventually becomes conviction. By the time Ethan's accident happened, Laura was not cautious about the Hells Angels anymore. She was grateful. She was protective of them in the particular way you become protective of people who have shown you repeatedly, and without requiring anything in return, that they are exactly who they claim to be. She had become, over the years, the chapter's unofficial financial administrator for charitable activities. The person who tracked the donations maintained the records filed. The paperwork ensured that every dollar raised in the name of helping someone could be accounted for in precise and verifiable detail. It was, given what was about to happen, a terrible irony. The fund for Ethan's surgery sat at $36,400 on the morning of September 14th, $1,400 short of the gap. And two members of the chapter had already texted Laura that morning saying they were each putting in $700 by end of day. She was going to make it. She had been going to tell Ethan that afternoon. She had been sitting in room 214 with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched and a folder of paperwork spread across the small bedside table, and she had been trying to figure out exactly what words to use, how to tell a man who had been in pain for 4 years that the last obstacle had just been cleared when she heard the footsteps in the hallway. She didn't look up at first. Hospital hallways were full of footsteps, but these ones stopped outside room 214. And then the door opened in a way that was different from the way doctors and nurses opened doors, slower, more deliberate, with the particular quality of people who were entering a space they considered they had authority over. Two men in suits stepped into the room. One was tall, mid-40s, with a face that had the composed blankness of someone trained to reveal nothing. The other was shorter, younger, holding a manila folder with both hands, as though it might try to escape. "Mrs. Walker," the tall one said. Laura looked up. "I'm Special Agent Callum Briggs from the Financial Crimes Unit. This is my colleague investigator Dan Perez. We need to speak with you about some irregular financial activity associated with accounts linked to your name." Laura set down her coffee cup very carefully. Beside her, Ethan had gone completely still. "What kind of irregular activity?" Laura said. "Multiple cash deposits structured below federal reporting thresholds across 17 separate transactions over a period of 8 months, Briggs said. "The pattern is consistent with money laundering methodology." The word landed in the room like something physical. Ethan's hand reached for the bed rail. "Those deposits are charity donations," Laura said. She kept her voice level with an effort that was visible only in the slight tightening around her eyes. "Every one of them is documented. I have records for every single transaction going back 3 years." "We're aware that you have documentation," Perez said, opening the manila folder. "We're questioning the source and legitimacy of the funds." "The source is people," Laura said. "People donating money for community aid, for surgeries, for families who need help." "Specifically," Briggs said, and now there was something different in his voice, a flatness that was almost practiced. "People affiliated with the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club." The room went very quiet. Ethan looked at his wife. Laura looked at Agent Briggs. "Yes," she said, "some of them, and veterans, and local business owners, and a retired school teacher who donated $40 a month for 2 years because she believed in what we were doing. Would you like her name?" Briggs did not answer that question. Instead, he said, "Mrs. Walker, I need you to come with us." Laura stood up from her chair slowly. "Am I under arrest?" she said. "We'd like to bring you in for questioning regarding—" "Am I under arrest?" she said again, and her voice was perfectly steady, and it was that steadiness, that absolute refusal to become the thing they were expecting her to become, that made Ethan grip the bed rail hard enough that his knuckles went white. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "Mrs. Walker, you are under arrest for financial crimes." And that was when Laura Walker did the thing that would eventually bring 300 motorcycles to the steps of the Bridgeport Federal Courthouse. She did not scream. She did not cry. She did not argue or beg or lose her composure in any of the ways that the two men in suits had probably expected. She looked at Ethan, and she made a single small gesture with her left hand, a movement so subtle that neither Callum Briggs nor Dan Perez noticed it because it wasn't meant for them. It was a signal. An old one, something between people who had spent enough time together to build their own private language. A signal that said, "I need help." Not just I need help in the ordinary sense of needing assistance. Help in the way that only certain people could provide it, people who knew what kind of help was being asked for without being told. That money isn't mine, Laura said quietly as the handcuffs closed around her wrists. It's for my husband's surgery. Nobody in that room said anything. And then the two agents walked Laura Walker out of room 214 and down the hospital hallway past nurses and patients and visitors who stopped and stared. And the sound of the handcuffs was very small in the large institutional quiet of St. Vincent's Medical Center. And Ethan Walker lay in his hospital bed and watched his wife disappear through the double doors at the end of the hall, and then he was alone. What Ethan did in the next 45 minutes mattered more than almost anything else that happened in this story. He didn't call a lawyer first, though he knew he needed one. He didn't call the chapter directly, though he knew they needed to know. He lay there for approximately 3 minutes, completely still, processing what had just occurred with the careful internal discipline of a man who had learned through years of writing and years of pain and years of watching things go wrong in ways that couldn't be immediately fixed, that the first 60 seconds of panic were the most dangerous 60 seconds of any crisis. That the thing you did in that window, the call you made, the story you told yourself, the decision you locked into before you had enough information could determine everything that followed. So he breathed, and then he picked up his phone. He called their attorney first, a woman named Sandra Cho, who had handled the chapter's legal matters for 6 years and who answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting while Ethan told her what had happened, and who said, "I'm in court until 4. I'll be at the federal building by 4:30, in the tone of someone who had already begun preparing. Then he called Marcus Reynolds. Marcus Stone Reynolds was 62 years old and had been the chapter president for 11 years and had known Ethan Walker since Ethan was a prospect who didn't know enough to be nervous about the things that should have made him nervous. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with gray threading through his beard and the particular quality of stillness that comes from having spent a long time being someone other people brought their worst moments to. Marcus answered immediately. "Talk to me," he said. Ethan talked. He told Marcus about the agents, about the accusations, about the word laundering, about the handcuffs on Laura's wrists, about the $36,400 in the fund that was now presumably frozen and inaccessible, and about the surgery that was scheduled for Monday morning, and about what it would mean if that surgery didn't happen. Marcus listened to all of it. When Ethan finished, there was a brief silence. "She send the signal?" Marcus asked. "Yeah," Ethan said. Another brief silence. "Okay," Marcus said. That was all he said? Just okay. But Ethan knew what that word contained. He knew what it set in motion. He had seen Marcus say that word before in other contexts about other problems, and he knew that when Marcus said okay in that particular way, quiet, certain, without additional commentary, it meant that Marcus had already begun the process of doing whatever needed to be done. Ethan hung up and stared at the ceiling of room 214 and tried to believe that it was going to be enough. Marcus Reynolds had been many things in his life before he became the person he was now. He had been a young man with a temper he didn't know how to manage and a talent for getting into situations that required the kind of exit strategies he hadn't yet developed. He had been a mechanic, a rider, a soldier for 2 years in his early 20s before an injury pulled him out of that life. He had been in his early 30s, the kind of man that respectable people crossed the street to avoid, not because he was dangerous in any random or careless way, but because he radiated the specific energy of someone who had decided that the world operated on different rules than the ones most people publicly acknowledged, and who had made his peace with that conclusion. But Marcus had also been, for the last 30 years, the kind of man who showed up. He showed up when other people didn't. He showed up at hospitals, in funerals, in courthouses, in job sites, and in the middle of the night when someone called him in crisis, and in the middle of the afternoon when someone needed to talk. He showed up in situations that didn't require him to be there, and in situations that required him to put himself at significant personal inconvenience, and sometimes at genuine risk. And he showed up consistently without keeping score, in a way that had accumulated over decades into something that looked from the outside like loyalty, but felt from the inside more like identity. This was who Marcus Reynolds was, and when he hung up the phone after talking to Ethan Walker, he did not hesitate. He pulled up his contacts and started calling. Not the full chapter first that would happen, but not first. First, he called the people who knew Laura Walker directly, The men and women who had sat at her kitchen table, who had handed her envelopes of cash for the fund, who had let her into the particular private world of their charitable work because she had proven herself worthy of being let in. He called Big Jim Mercer, who had donated $2,000 to the fund in August after Laura helped organize the fundraiser for his brother's dialysis treatment. Jim answered in the middle of a job site and said, "I'm leaving now," before Marcus finished the second sentence. He called Donna Reeves, 58, who had been riding with the chapter's women's auxiliary for 9 years, and who had, in the last 3 years, become one of Laura's closest friends. Donna said, "That's wrong," very quietly, and then said, "What do you need from me?" And Marcus told her. He called Terry Walsh, who ran a machine shop in Fairfield, and who had worked alongside Ethan on 3 different charity renovation projects, and who said when Marcus finished explaining, "Do you know who signed the arrest warrant?" "Working on it," Marcus said. "Get me a name," Terry said. Marcus worked through his list systematically for the next 2 hours, pausing only to check his messages and to respond to the texts that were already beginning to come in as word spread through the networks that operated below the level of the official chapter. Communications, the informal architecture of people who knew. People who knew people, the organic intelligence system that had always been the most effective part of how the chapter actually functioned. By 2 in the afternoon, Marcus had made 22 direct calls. By 4 in the afternoon, those 22 calls had become 140 conversations. By 6 in the afternoon, something was happening that Marcus hadn't fully planned, but had perhaps known on some level would happen, because this was what always happened when the community understood that one of its own had been genuinely wronged. People were moving. Sandra Cho arrived at the federal building at 4:27 and was inside with Laura by 4:40. Laura, who had spent the intervening hours in a holding room with a paper cup of cold coffee, in the particular suspended quality of someone waiting for the world to either collapse or hold, looked up when Sandra walked in and felt something release in her chest. "Tell me everything," Sandra said, sitting down. Laura told her everything. Not just the arrest, the whole context, the 14 months of fundraising, the documentation system she'd built, every receipt, every donation record, every email trail, the way she'd cross-reference everything against bank statements, because she was a nurse and she understood that when something went wrong and you needed to prove you'd done things correctly, the documentation was the difference between walking out and not walking out. Sandra listened with the focused attention of someone who was simultaneously absorbing information and building a structure. "They're calling it structuring," Sandra said, "the deposits under $10,000. "Because donors gave me what they gave me," Laura said. "Nobody sat down and said, let's all give amounts that fall under reporting thresholds. I was getting $200 here, $500 there, sometimes $1,000, sometimes less. I deposited them when I received them. The amounts weren't structured, they were just what people gave." "I know," Sandra said. "They're going to say it's connected to the Hells Angels," Laura said. "Yes. And they're going to let that word do the work for them." And Sandra looked at her client for a moment. "Who's the prosecutor?" Laura asked. Sandra paused for exactly 1 second, which was 1 second longer than she usually paused. "Daniel Whitmore," she said. Laura absorbed that. Daniel Whitmore was not unknown to her. He was not unknown to anyone in the county who paid attention to local politics, which Laura did because she was a nurse in a community hospital, and local politics had a way of affecting the people in her care in very direct and material ways. Whitmore was 44, ambitious, and currently 6 points behind in his campaign for the state's attorney position. He had built his career on aggressive prosecutions and had a particular talent for choosing cases that generated media attention. A case involving a Hells Angels member's wife and a suspected charity fraud scheme involving a motorcycle club was not a case that would be difficult to make into a story. "He needs this," Laura said quietly. "He thinks he does," Sandra said. "Sandra," Laura looked at her directly, "what happens to Ethan's surgery if the fund stays frozen?" Sandra didn't look away. "Then you find another way to raise the money," she said, "or you push the surgery." "Dr. Holloway said the window closes." "I know. He said that if we push past October 10th, I know, Laura." The two women looked at each other across the table. "I need to be out of here before Monday," Laura said. "I know," Sandra said. "We're going to work on that." The video of Laura's Risher's arrest had been taken by a visitor in the hallway of St. Vincent's, a young woman named Kezia Monroe who had been there visiting her grandmother, and who had filmed the moment on her phone with the particular instinct of someone who knew in that way that you sometimes simply know that she was watching something that mattered. The video was 43 seconds long. It showed Laura Walker standing very still in the hallway while two men in suits moved around her. It showed the handcuffs. It showed Laura's face composed, steady, frighteningly composed, as she said the words that Kezia had already managed to hear clearly enough through her phone's microphone. "My husband's surgery is in 3 days." Kezia had posted the video at 3:47 p.m. By the time Marcus Reynolds saw it at 6:22 p.m., it had been viewed 11,000 times. Marcus watched it 3 times, and on the third viewing he paused it at the moment, just before the handcuffs were put on Laura's wrists. He watched Laura's left hand, he watched it very carefully, and then he put his phone down on the table and sat very still for almost a full minute, because he had seen that signal. He had seen it years ago, the first time not from Laura, but from Ethan, in a different kind of crisis and circumstances he didn't need to revisit. He had taught Ethan that signal. He had explained it as a practical measure in situations where you cannot speak freely, in situations where you need to communicate need without alerting the people around you to the fact that you are communicating a small gesture to the right person was worth 100 words. Ethan had taught it to Laura. And Laura, in the hallway of St. Vincent's Medical Center, with handcuffs being placed on her wrists and her husband's surgery 3 days away, had used it. Not for the camera. The camera had caught it by accident. She had used it for Ethan, but Marcus had seen it. And Marcus had spent the last several hours making calls, but now watching that signal in the paused video, understanding what Laura had been communicating in the moment she made it, something shifted in him. This wasn't just about clearing her name. This wasn't just about freeing the fund. This was about a woman who had spent years helping people, who had documented everything correctly, who had done nothing wrong, being arrested in a hospital hallway in front of her sick husband because a prosecutor needed a headline. Marcus Reynolds picked up his phone, and he made a different kind of call. By 9 o'clock that night, the group message had gone to 412 people across 6 states. It was not a complicated message. It contained the video, a brief explanation of what had happened, the time and location of Laura's preliminary hearing, scheduled for Monday morning, the same morning as Ethan's surgery, and 3 words that Marcus had thought about carefully before including, "She needs us." 3 words. That was all. By 10:30, responses were coming back faster than Marcus could read them. "I'm in. Coming from Providence. How many?" "Got 12 from our chapter. Where do you want us?" "We'll be there. Bringing the guys from Hartford. See you Monday." "She organized 3 fundraisers for our families. We don't forget. I've been to 4 events she ran. I'm coming. What time should we arrive?" "Driving from Albany. Can anyone confirm parking situation near the courthouse?" "My brother got help from that fund 2 years ago. I'm coming." Marcus read every single one. He didn't respond to all of them immediately. He didn't need to. The logistics were organizing themselves the way they always did when the community understood what was actually being asked. Not an obligation, not a command, but a simple statement of fact. Someone who had always shown up for others needed people to show up for her. At 11:45, Marcus sent one more message. It said, "Be there at 8, peaceful, professional. Let people see who we actually are." He put his phone down. He hadn't eaten since lunch. He heated up a bowl of soup in the microwave and sat at his kitchen table and thought about Ethan Walker lying in a hospital bed waiting for Monday morning, and about Laura Walker in federal holding, and about Daniel Whitmore going home to whatever house Daniel Whitmore went home to, probably feeling very confident about what was going to shape up in the morning. Daniel Whitmore, Marcus thought, had made a significant error. He had looked at the Hells Angels chapter and seen an organization with a reputation he could leverage. He had not looked carefully enough at what that organization had actually been doing. He had seen the name. He had not seen the people. That Marcus thought drinking his soup was going to be a problem for Daniel Whitmore. Laura Walker did not sleep well in federal holding. This was not surprising. What surprised her later when she thought about that night was how calm she actually was underneath the fear. Not the absence of fear, and the fear was present and real and specific fear about Ethan, about Monday, about the fund, about what Daniel Whitmore was going to try to do with a jury that might decide that Hells Angels and financial crimes was a combination that spoke for itself. But underneath the fear was something else. She had the documentation. She had Sandra. And she thought lying on the narrow cot in the holding room, staring at the ceiling, the truth, which she knew from her years as a nurse was not always sufficient. She had watched people with the truth get destroyed by people with better narratives. She had watched the medical system fail patients who were right about what was happening to their own bodies because the right people didn't listen at the right time. The truth was necessary, but not sufficient. You needed someone to tell it. You needed someone to make it heard. She thought about the small gesture she'd made in the hallway before the handcuffs went on. She thought about whether Ethan had seen it clearly enough. She thought about whether it had even mattered, whether the situation was already beyond the reach of that kind of help. And then she thought about Marcus Reynolds. And she thought if Ethan saw it, and if Marcus knows, she stopped herself. She pulled the thin blanket up and closed her eyes. She had done what she could do. Now she had to wait. In room 214 of St. Vincent's Medical Center, Ethan Walker was also not sleeping. He was lying in the dark phone in his hand watching the responses come into the group message that Marcus had forwarded to him as a courtesy, not because Ethan needed to coordinate anything, but because Marcus understood that knowing what was moving would matter to him. Ethan read every message. He read the one from Terry Walsh, who said he was driving in from Bridgeport and bringing 8 guys. He read the one from the woman in Providence who said she remembered when Laura had helped organize the fundraiser that covered her son's physical therapy after his construction accident. He read the message from an older man named Doug Hartley, who had been writing for 40 years and who wrote only, "Nobody arrests a good woman in front of her sick husband and calls it justice. See you Monday." Ethan read all of them. He did not sleep, but somewhere around 2 in the morning he noticed that the fear had changed its quality. It was still there, but it was no longer the only thing in the room. Something else was present now, something that didn't have a clean name, but that felt in the dark of the hospital room like the particular solidity of people standing beside you before you can see them. Ethan Walker closed his eyes, and he breathed, and he waited for Monday morning. The Sunday before the hearing, Sandra Cho came back to see Laura with her laptop and a printed stack of documents nearly 2 inches thick. She set it on the table between them. "I've been in contact with 3 of the donors directly," Sandra said. "I have signed statements from all of them confirming the voluntary nature of their contributions and the intended use of the funds. I have bank records showing the complete chain of deposits and withdrawals. I have 12 months of email correspondence documenting the charitable purposes." Laura looked at the stack. "What's he going to say?" she asked. She didn't need to specify who she meant. Sandra leaned back in her chair. "He's going to say the pattern of deposits suggests intentional structuring to avoid reporting requirements. He's going to imply that the charitable purpose is a cover for channeling money connected to illegal activity. He's going to say the Hells Angels connection is relevant context." "And is he wrong about the deposits?" Laura asked directly. She was not asking as a defendant protecting herself. She was asking as a nurse who believed in accurate diagnosis. "The deposits were made in amounts that individually fell below reporting thresholds," Sandra said. "That is a fact. The reason they fell below those thresholds is not because you or anyone else engineered them to avoid scrutiny. It's because donors gave what they gave. But Whitmore can frame the pattern as intentional." "Can he make that case?" Laura said. Sandra was quiet for a moment. "He can make it look credible to someone who wants to believe it," she said. "He cannot make it look credible to someone who looks at the complete documentation." "Then we show them the complete documentation," Laura said. That's the plan. Sandra. Laura looked at her. "Tell me honestly, is there something in his case that worries you?" Sandra looked back at her client for a long moment. "There's one thing," she said. "I've been trying to get my hands on the original tip that triggered the investigation. Someone flagged your account to the Financial Crimes Unit. I don't know yet who that was or why they did it at this specific moment." Laura was quiet. "At this specific moment," she repeated. 3 days before the surgery," Sandra said. "Yes." The 2 women sat with that for a moment. "Someone knew about the surgery," Laura said. "Someone knew about the surgery," Sandra confirmed, "and they wanted the fund frozen before it could be used." "That's one explanation." "Is there another one?" Laura asked. Sandra said nothing, which was itself an answer. Laura sat with the knowledge of that for a long time after Sandra left. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone had looked at 14 months of careful, documented, genuine charitable work and used the architecture of financial law to turn it into something that looked like a crime at the exact moment when it would cause the most damage to the most vulnerable person, which was not Laura herself, but Ethan, lying in room 214 waiting for a surgery that might not happen now. Whoever had done this had known about Ethan, which meant they had known about the fund, which meant they were not a random financial analyst who had stumbled across a suspicious pattern. They had been looking. Laura pressed her palms flat on the table. She breathed slowly. She thought, find out who wanted this to happen, and you find out why it happened. And if you find out why it happened, you give Sandra something to work with that was worth more than any stack of documents. Because the documents prove she hadn't done anything wrong. But whoever had triggered this investigation might be able to prove something much more significant. That she hadn't just not done anything wrong, that someone had done something wrong to her. And that was a different kind of case entirely. Sandra Cho drove home from the federal building at 9:15 Sunday night with the particular tension in her shoulders that came not from a case she couldn't win, but from a case she suspected was worse than it appeared on paper. She had been practicing law for 19 years. She had handled difficult cases. She had handled cases where the evidence was clear and the outcome was still uncertain. She had handled cases where the evidence was murky and the outcome had nonetheless been just. She knew the difference between a case that was complicated and a case that was corrupt, and she knew that distinction mattered enormously, not because it changed the legal strategy necessarily, but because it changed what you were actually fighting. A complicated case was a technical problem. A corrupt case was a human problem, and human problems required human solutions. She parked outside her office, went upstairs, and pulled up everything she could find on Daniel Whitmore. Not his professional record, she already knew that. 14 years as a prosecutor, conviction rate north of 70%, known for selecting cases that moved fast and made noise. His record in court was solid enough. His record in choosing cases was what interested her now. She found the polling data first. Whitmore was running for state's attorney. His campaign had been built on a law and order platform that played well in the suburbs, but had struggled to find traction against an incumbent who had 20 years of name recognition and a clean record. His campaign manager, a man named Phil Greer, whose name came up in several political reporting pieces from the last 8 months, had been quoted in a local newspaper saying that Whitmore needed a defining moment, a case that shows voters he's serious about organized crime and financial predators. A defining moment. Sandra read that phrase 3 times. She pulled up the original complaint that had triggered the financial crimes investigation. The complaint was technically an internal referral, meaning it had originated not from a public tip line, but from within the financial monitoring system flagged by an analyst whose name was listed as Kevin Marshall. Sandra knew financial crimes investigations. She knew that most of them began with algorithmic flags automated systems that identified patterns in transaction data. A human analyst reviewed the flag and made a determination about whether it warranted escalation. Kevin Marshall had escalated. Sandra pulled up Kevin Marshall's professional profile. He was 34, a financial analyst who had been with the Financial Crimes Unit for 6 years. Nothing unusual there, nothing that stood out. Except for one thing, Kevin Marshall had given a small campaign donation of $250 to Daniel Whitmore's state's attorney campaign 7 months ago. Sandra sat back in her chair. $250 was not a large amount. It was not in isolation meaningful. People donated to campaigns all the time. It did not establish a relationship. It did not establish coordination. It did not by itself prove anything. But it was a thread. And Sandra Cho had spent 19 years learning what to do when you found a thread. You pulled it. She started pulling. Marcus Reynolds was at the chapter's garage at 7 in the morning on Monday when his phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was a number he didn't recognize, an area code from Western Connecticut, someone he hadn't called and hadn't expected to hear from. He answered anyway because at 7 in the morning on the day of the hearing, he was answering everything. Marcus Reynolds, said the voice on the other end. Speaking, Marcus said. My name is Carl Brixton. I drove in from Waterbury last night. I heard about what happened to Laura Walker, and I need to tell you something that I don't think anyone else knows. Marcus was very still. Tell me, he said. Carl Brixton was 51 years old. He had ridden for 20 years, not with the Bridgeport chapter, but with a smaller club that had no formal affiliation, but maintain the kind of friendly relationship built on years of crossing paths at charity events and sharing the particular understanding that came from being people the general public had already decided they knew everything about. He had met Laura Walker 4 years ago at a fundraiser she'd organized for a veterans family in New Haven. "She's the real thing," Carl said. "I gave money to that fund twice. I watched her run those events. I've never seen anyone more careful with other people's money than that woman." "I know," Marcus said. "What do you need to tell me, Carl?" Carl was quiet for a second. "3 weeks ago," he said, "I was at a bar in Waterbury, not a place I usually go. A friend of mine wanted to meet there, so I went. And I ended up sitting close enough to two men at the next table that I could hear what they were saying, whether I wanted to or not." Marcus waited. "One of them was talking about a motorcycle club wife, talking about a fund she ran. He used the words charity fraud and perfect timing. He said something like, 'If this moves before the Monday, the surgery fund gets frozen and the whole thing falls apart.' I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't know who he meant. I figured it was something I wasn't supposed to hear, and I let it go." Marcus's jaw tightened. "And then I saw the video," Carl said. "Laura Walker, arrested on Friday, Ethan Walker's surgery on Monday, and I realized what I'd heard." "Did you see the man's face?" Marcus said. "Yeah," Carl said. "I did." "Would you recognize him?" "I would." "Can you be at the Bridgeport Federal Courthouse at 8:30? "I'm already parked outside your garage," Carl said. Marcus put down the phone and stood very still for approximately 5 seconds. Then he walked to the garage door, opened it, and looked out into the early morning light. A man he'd never met was leaning against a motorcycle 40 feet away watching him. Marcus walked over and extended his hand. "Come inside," he said. "Tell me everything you remember." The riders began arriving at 7:45, not in a rush, not in chaos, in the deliberate, organized way of people who understood that what they were doing required a specific kind of presence, visible, undeniable, and completely controlled. They came on their motorcycles and they parked on the street outside the federal courthouse in a line that began at the corner and extended half a block by 8 o'clock and 3/4 of a block by 8:15 and nearly a full block by 8:30. They wore their colors. They did not make noise. They stood beside their bikes or sat on them or grouped in small clusters of conversation. And the overall effect, the visual fact of it, was something that several courthouse workers and attorneys arriving for Monday morning sessions stopped to observe with expressions that ranged from uncertainty to something approaching awe. There were not yet 300 of them, but by 8:45, the number was close to 200, and more were coming. Inside the federal building in a conference room on the 3rd floor, Sandra Cho was doing 3 things simultaneously. She was reviewing her morning's notes. She was fielding a call from a journalist named Renata Voss at the Bridgeport Post, who had seen the crowd forming outside and wanted a comment. And she was waiting for a call she had placed at 6:30 in the morning to someone she hadn't spoken to in 4 years, a woman named Patricia Eng, who worked in the Financial Crimes Unit as a senior analyst and who had on 2 previous occasions been willing to speak to Sandra off the record about procedural matters that were relevant to cases Sandra was handling. The call came back at 8:50. "I can't talk long," Patricia said immediately. "I know," Sandra said. "I just need one thing. Kevin Marshall's referral on the Walker case, was it algorithm-generated or discretionary?" A pause. "Sandra, Patricia, one thing." Another pause. Longer this time. "Discretionary," Patricia said quietly. "The algorithm flagged it as low priority. Kevin escalated it manually." "When 3 weeks ago." Sandra wrote that down. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't tell you anything," Patricia said and hung up. Sandra set her phone down and looked at what she had. Kevin Marshall had manually escalated a low priority flag 3 weeks ago, 7 months, after donating $250 to Daniel Whitmore's campaign. Taken individually, each of those facts was meaningless. Together, they were the beginning of a pattern. Sandra needed one more piece. She needed to know who Kevin Marshall was talking to in the 3 weeks between his discretionary escalation and Laura Walker's arrest on Friday. She picked up her phone and made another call. Ethan Walker had been awake since 4:30. He had not turned the light on. He had lain in the darkness of room 214 and watched his phone screen and tracked the incoming messages and tried to build a clear picture of what Monday was going to look like. Not the surgery which Dr. Holloway had confirmed was still on the schedule pending resolution of the fund situation, but the hearing which was the variable that controlled everything else. At 8:15, he received a text from Marcus that said only 200 and counting, more coming. Ethan read that 3 times. He was not a man who cried easily. He had spent 4 years in chronic pain and had learned in the way that people who live with persistent pain always learn to manage emotional response, the way you managed physical response by finding the center of it and staying there, not because you didn't feel it, but because you couldn't afford to let it sweep you out of functional range. But reading that text, 200, and counting more coming, he felt something move through him that was too large and too specific to be held still. He put the phone down on his chest. He breathed. He thought about every ride they had done together, every fundraiser Laura had organized, every time she had sat at the kitchen table late at night with spreadsheets and receipts, and the particular focused expression she wore when she was accounting for every dollar, not out of obligation, but out of the genuine conviction that when people trusted you with their generosity, you owed them the fullest possible accounting of how it was used. He thought about the way Marcus had taught him things over the years that were not about writing. Things about loyalty, about showing up, about the difference between people who said the right things and people who did the right things, and about how over a lifetime that difference became the entire difference. He thought about Laura making that signal in the hospital hallway. He thought she knew. Even in that moment with handcuffs going on her wrists, she knew that the signal would reach the right people. She knew because she had spent 7 years watching who those people actually were, and she trusted it the way you trust something you have tested repeatedly and found reliable every single time. His phone buzzed again. It was from a number he didn't have saved. The message said, "My name is Carl Brixton. I met your wife at the New Haven fundraiser 4 years ago. I have information about what happened. I'm with Marcus. She's going to be okay." Ethan read that message 4 times. Then he called his nurse and asked her to please tell Dr. Holloway that the surgery was still on for Monday. Daniel Whitmore arrived at the federal building at 8:50 and saw the motorcycles. He stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the line of bikes and riders that extended along the courthouse block, and he felt something shift inside him that he would later describe to his campaign manager in a very different and much more private conversation as, "The first moment I thought we might have a problem." He did not show this on his face. He was a prosecutor. He knew how to manage his expression. He walked into the building with his assistant, David Kang, 2 steps behind him, carrying the case files, and he went through security and took the elevator to the courtroom floor and walked into his preparation room and closed the door. "How many are out there?" he said. 220, maybe 230, David said. "More arriving." Whitmore sat down. He had anticipated some kind of response. He was not naive about the Hells Angels' sense of community loyalty. He had anticipated a small demonstration, maybe 30 or 40 people, the kind of thing that looked sympathetic on camera, but didn't actually affect the legal proceedings. 230 was not 30. 230 was a statement. "It doesn't matter," he said. It came out slightly less certain than he intended. "Of course not," David said in a tone that suggested he was not entirely sure about that either. Whitmore opened the case file. The legal argument was solid. The structuring pattern was real. The Hells Angels connection was documentable. The jury pool in Bridgeport was not going to look at a motorcycle club's charitable activities and automatically assume legitimacy, not when they'd been primed carefully and methodically to understand the historical context of the organization. He had a good case. He was going to win. He read through his notes and told himself that twice more. Sandra reached Laura at 9:10 when they brought Laura to the conference room for a pre-hearing meeting. Laura looked tired but not broken. She had the expression of someone who had not slept and had spent the waking hours building something internal that was going to hold her together through whatever the morning required. "I need to tell you 3 things, Sandra said, sitting down fast and opening her laptop. "First, I have verbal confirmation that Kevin Marshall's referral on your case was a discretionary escalation of a low-priority flag. The algorithm did not identify this as urgent. He chose to make it urgent." Laura was watching her very carefully. "Second, Kevin Marshall donated $250 to Whitmore's campaign 7 months ago." Silence. "Third," Sandra said, "and this is the part that changes everything, a witness contacted Marcus Reynolds this morning, a man named Carl Brixton, 3 weeks ago, he overheard a conversation in a bar in Waterbury. Two men discussing the timing of an action that would freeze your fund before Monday. He heard the words charity fraud and perfect timing. He didn't connect it to you until he saw the arrest video. Laura's expression was completely still. He can identify one of the men, Sandra said. He's willing to testify to what he heard. Who was it? Laura said. The man he recognized. Sandra held her gaze. He's going to look at some photographs for us this morning, Sandra said. We'll know in about an hour. Laura breathed slowly. Sandra, she said, if Whitmore knew about the surgery, if this was deliberately timed, then this is not a financial crimes prosecution, Sandra said. This is targeted interference with a legitimate charitable fund designed to prevent a specific medical procedure. The word interference hung in the air between them. That's a very different kind of case, Laura said. It is, Sandra said. For him, Laura said. She didn't need to explain who she meant. Yes, Sandra said. For him. They looked at each other for a moment. How long do we have before the hearing? Laura asked. 40 minutes, Sandra said. Make the 40 minutes count, Laura said. Sandra was already dialing. Marcus brought Carl Brixton to a side room off the courthouse lobby at 9:15. Sandra had emailed him 6 photographs of staff headshots from the Financial Crimes Unit and from Whitmore's campaign office, mixed with 4 random individuals to prevent any appearance of suggestion. Marcus spread the printed photos on the table. Take your time, he said. Carl Brixton looked at the photos the way someone looks at something they want to be absolutely certain about before they commit to saying it out loud. He moved his finger slowly from one photo to the next, and Marcus watched his face for anything that looked like recognition. It came on the 4th photograph. Not dramatic, not an exclamation, just a very slight tightening around Carl's eyes, and then a stillness, and then Carl said in a voice that was completely flat and completely certain, "That one." Marcus looked at the photo Carl was pointing to. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he took out his phone and called Sandra. 4th photo, he said when she answered. Sandra was quiet for 2 seconds. Are you sure? She said. Carl's sure, Marcus said. Okay, Sandra said. Give me 15 minutes. She hung up. Marcus looked at Carl Brixton. You understand you may need to say this in front of a judge, Marcus said. I understand, Carl said. It won't be comfortable. She organized a fundraiser that paid for my cousin's cancer treatment, Carl said. 2 years ago. She didn't know me. She just knew someone needed help. He paused. I'm fine with uncomfortable. Marcus nodded. Outside the courthouse, the number of riders had reached 260. The 4th photograph was not Kevin Marshall. The 4th photograph was Phil Greer, Daniel Whitmore's campaign manager. Sandra Cho spent 11 of her 15 minutes confirming what she now believed she knew, using 2 phone calls, one to a political reporter who had covered Whitmore's campaign extensively and had mentioned Phil Greer's name in 3 separate pieces, and one to a contact in the county clerk's office, who confirmed something that was technically public record, but not easily findable without knowing where to look. Phil Greer had previously worked for 14 months, ending 2 years ago, as a consultant for Hartwell Development Group, a real estate development company that had been trying for the past 3 years to acquire a parcel of land in Bridgeport's east side, on which sat, among other things, the garage and meeting space the Bridgeport Hells Angels chapter used for their charitable operations. The acquisition had stalled. The chapter had refused to sell. Laura Walker had organized 3 community meetings in the past 18 months, arguing against the development project, citing its impact on affordable housing in the neighborhood. Sandra sat with all of that for approximately 45 seconds. Then she walked directly to the courtroom. The hearing was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock. By 9:50, every seat in the courtroom was filled. Sandra arrived at 9:47 and went immediately to the bench to request a brief conference with Judge Miriam Castillo before proceedings began. Whitmore's second chair, a young attorney named Brianna Wells, watched Sandra approach the bench with the focused alertness of someone who understood that an opposing attorney requesting a pre-hearing bench conference was almost never good news for their side. Judge Castillo was 58 with 22 years on the federal bench, and the particular quality of someone who had heard every variety of legal argument and maintained her skepticism about all of them equally. She looked at Sandra over her reading glasses. Miss Cho, she said. Your Honor, I apologize for the timing of this request, Sandra said quietly, but I've become aware of information this morning that has material bearing on the integrity of the prosecution in this case. I'm requesting a brief recess prior to proceedings beginning so that I can present that information to the court. Judge Castillo looked at her. How brief, she said. 20 minutes, Sandra said. The judge looked at Whitmore, who had appeared at Sandra's shoulder with the controlled expression of a man who was trying very hard not to look alarmed. Mr. Whitmore, the judge said. Objection. Whitmore looked at Sandra. He did not know exactly what she had, but he had been a prosecutor for 14 years, and he knew that an attorney who requested a pre-hearing bench conference with that expression on her face was not fishing. She had something. No objection, he said. His voice was very even. It cost him something to make it that even. Judge Castillo nodded. 20 minutes, she said. My chambers. What happened in Judge Castillo's chambers over the next 22 minutes was not technically a formal proceeding. It was a conversation, but it was the kind of conversation that determined whether a formal proceeding would happen at all. Sandra laid out what she had methodically and without drama, which was in its own way more dramatic than anything theatrical could have been. The low-priority algorithm flag manually escalated by Kevin Marshall. The campaign donation, Carl Brixton's account of the overheard conversation 3 weeks earlier, the identification of Phil Greer, the Hartwell development connection, the chapter's garage, Laura Walker's community organizing against the development project. She presented it as a set of facts that taken individually were explainable by coincidence. Taken together, they described something else. Whitmore sat across the table from her and did not speak for most of it. He was thinking. Sandra could see him thinking, could see him running the calculations she knew he was running. How much of this was provable right now? How much of it was circumstantial? Whether the individual threads held or whether they unraveled under examination, and most importantly, what it meant for him, if this went into the courtroom and came out the other side with any of it attached to his name. Judge Castillo asked 3 precise questions: whether Sandra had documentation of the campaign donation, whether Carl Brixton was prepared to provide a sworn statement, and whether Sandra was prepared to subpoena Greer's communications with Marshall. To all 3, Sandra said yes. The room was very quiet. Mr. Whitmore, Judge Castillo said. She was looking at him with the expression of someone who had arrived at a conclusion they found personally distasteful. Is there anything you want to say? Whitmore looked at the table in front of him for a long moment. Then he looked at Judge Castillo. I need to make a phone call, he said. You have 10 minutes, the judge said. Whitmore stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out of chambers. Sandra did not watch him go. She looked at her hands on the table and breathed steadily, and thought about Laura Walker, who had been sitting in a holding cell since Friday because someone wanted a headline and someone else wanted a real estate deal, and they had calculated somewhere along the way that a nurse who organized charity rides was an acceptable casualty of their ambitions. She thought about Ethan Walker in room 214 with his surgery scheduled for this morning. She breathed. She waited. 8 minutes later, Whitmore came back. He sat down. He looked at Judge Castillo. The prosecution is prepared to move for dismissal of all charges, he said, pending a review of the evidentiary basis for the original referral. The words came out of him with the particular quality of something that had cost him more than he'd expected to spend. Judge Castillo looked at him for a long moment. The motion will be accepted, she said. The charges against Mrs. Walker are dismissed. The asset freeze will be lifted effective immediately. She paused. I will also be referring this matter for a review of prosecutorial conduct. Whitmore nodded once. He did not look at Sandra. Judge Castillo stood. Tell Mrs. Walker she may go, she said. Sandra walked back into the holding area at 10:23. Laura looked up from the table. Sandra sat down across from her. She looked at her client for one moment, just one, the kind of pause that means something is about to be said, that has weight, and then she said, It's over. The charges are dismissed. Laura did not move for a full 3 seconds. Then something happened to her face that Sandra had never seen happen to a client before. Not relief exactly, not joy exactly, but a kind of unlocking, as though every muscle that had been holding the last 72 hours in place all at once released, and what was underneath was not collapse, but something that looked from the outside like a person returning to herself. The fund, Laura said. Released, Sandra said. effective immediately. The surgery. Call the hospital, Sandra said. Right now, call Ethan. Laura picked up her phone. Her hands were shaking slightly. She dialed. Ethan answered before the first ring completed. Laura, he said. It's dismissed, she said. The charges are gone. The fund is free. Call Dr. Holloway. Ethan said nothing for 2 seconds. Laura, he said again. I know, she said. Are you okay? I'm fine, she said. I'm fine. Call the doctor. I love you, he said. I love you, she said. Call the doctor. She hung up. She looked at Sandra. Thank you, she said. Sandra nodded. Don't thank me, she said. Thank Carl Brixton. Thank whoever taught Ethan that signal. Thank the 260 people outside who made this impossible to bury. Laura was quiet for a moment. 260, she said. Last count, Sandra said. More came while we were in chambers. Laura stood up. She smoothed her clothes with her palms. She took a breath. Take me outside, she said. The doors of the federal building opened at 10:31. Laura Walker walked out. She was not what the crowd expected. Maybe no dramatic gesture, no raised fist, no speech. She walked through the doors and stopped at the top of the steps and looked out at the street and saw them. 273 riders, standing in the morning light, watching her. The sound that rose from the street was not a cheer exactly. It was something more complex, a collection of voices that expressed without organizing itself into words. The particular emotion of people who had shown up for something they believed in and were watching it work out the way things you believe in are supposed to work out, but so rarely do. Laura stood on the steps and looked at them. She saw faces she recognized and faces she didn't. She saw men and women who had sat at her kitchen table, and men and women she had never met who had driven hours because someone had sent a message that said, she needs us. She saw at the edge of the crowd a man she didn't know standing beside his motorcycle with the stillness of someone who had done a hard thing and was quietly glad he had done it, and she would not know until later that this was Carl Brixton. The man whose willingness to stand up for what he'd overheard in a bar in Waterbury had been the thing that broke the case open. She saw Marcus Reynolds. He was standing at the bottom of the steps, and he was watching her with the expression of someone who had expected this outcome and was nonetheless moved by it. Laura walked down the steps. She stopped in front of Marcus. You brought them, she said. Marcus shook his head once. No, he said. I made calls. They brought themselves. Laura looked at him. Ethan taught me that signal, she said. You taught him. I taught him a lot of things, Marcus said. He paid attention. So did they? Laura said, looking at the crowd. That's what happens, Marcus said. When you spend years doing the right thing, when nobody's watching, eventually somebody watches. Laura stood for a moment with all of that around her. The riders, the noise of engines starting up somewhere at the back of the crowd, the morning light. And she thought about the last 72 hours and about what it had cost and about what it had revealed. It had revealed Daniel Whitmore. It had revealed Phil Greer. It had revealed Kevin Marshall. But it had also revealed something else, something she had believed in for years, but had never seen tested at this scale under this kind of pressure with this much actually at stake. It had revealed who showed up, and that she thought as she turned and looked at 273 people who had driven from 6 states to stand on a street outside a courthouse for a woman most of them had never met. That was a kind of evidence that no one could argue with. She pulled out her phone. She called Ethan. The surgery, she said when he answered. Is it on? Dr. Holloway confirmed 20 minutes ago, Ethan said. 11:30. They moved it 2 hours. I'm coming, she said. Laura, Ethan said. What? Tell Marcus. He stopped. Just tell him. Laura looked at Marcus Reynolds, who was watching her with the quiet attention of someone who already knew what was being said. He knows, she said. She hung up. She looked at the street full of riders. She had a hospital to get to, and for the first time since Friday afternoon, nothing was standing in her way. Laura Walker arrived at St. Vincent's Medical Center at 11:04. She had not gone home first. She had not changed her clothes or eaten breakfast or done any of the practical things that the logical part of her brain kept suggesting she ought to do. She had gotten into Sandra's car outside the federal building and said hospital, and Sandra had driven without asking anything further, which was one of the many reasons Laura had trusted her for 6 years. The drive took 19 minutes. Laura spent most of it with her phone pressed to her ear, working through the calls that the last 72 hours had made necessary. Dr. Holloway's office to confirm she was en route, the hospital billing department to initiate the transfer from the now unfrozen fund, a brief and slightly incoherent call to her sister in Ohio, who had been texting since Saturday morning and deserved more than the two-word updates Laura had managed to send from the holding room. "You're out," her sister said when she answered. Her name was Grace, and she was 3 years older than Laura, and she had the particular quality of older siblings who have spent their lives being the steady one, which meant that when her voice cracked slightly on the word out, it meant something. "I'm out," Laura said. "I'm on my way to Ethan. The surgery's still on." "Laura," Grace said. "I know," Laura said. "I should have come. There was nothing you could have done." "I could have been there," Grace said. "That's not nothing." Laura pressed her free hand against her eyes for a moment. "Come for the recovery," she said. "Come when he needs people around. That's when it'll matter." Grace said okay in the quiet voice of someone who was going to book a flight as soon as she hung up. Laura knew her sister. She knew exactly what that okay meant. She hung up as Sandra pulled into the hospital drop-off lane. "I'll handle the paperwork with billing," Sandra said. "You go up." "Sandra." "Go," Sandra said. "I've got this part." Laura got out of the car and went through the entrance doors and took the elevator to the second floor and walked the hallway she had walked hundreds of times as a nurse, the same hallway she had been walked out of in handcuffs 72 hours ago, and pushed open the door of room 214. Ethan looked up. And for a moment, neither of them said anything, because there are things that happen between two people who have been through something together that don't need words and are actually diminished by them. Moments where language is too slow and too approximate for what is actually being communicated. Ethan reached out his hand. Laura crossed the room and took it. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. They stayed like that for a moment. "You look terrible," Ethan said. Laura laughed, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind that comes when the body releases something it has been holding at significant muscular effort for several days. "You're in a hospital bed," she said. "You don't get to comment on how people look." "Fair," he said. He was watching her with the attentive, steady quality he always had, the quality she had fallen in love with before she understood it, which was that Ethan Walker paid attention to the people he loved with a completeness that made you feel when he was looking at you like the most important thing in the room. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Ready," he said. "Scared." He considered that for a moment honestly. "Yeah," he said. "A little." "Me too," she said. "That's supposed to be reassuring." "I'm a nurse," she said. "I believe in accurate information." He squeezed her hand. "Tell me what happened," he said. "All of it. Not the summary, the actual thing." So she told him. She told him about the holding room and the cold coffee and the long night and Sandra arriving with the stack of documents. She told him about Carl Brixton and what he'd heard in the bar in Waterbury. She told him about Phil Greer's photograph and what Sandra had found about Hartwell Development in the garage and the 3 community meetings Laura had run against the project. Ethan was very still through all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "They came after you," he said slowly, "because you were fighting the development project." "That's what it looks like," Laura said. "And they used the fund," he said. "They used the thing you built for people who needed help, and they turned it into the thing they were going to destroy you with." "Yes," Laura said. Ethan's jaw was tight. "Hey," Laura said. He looked at her. "Don't go there right now," she said. "There's going to be time for all of that later. Right now, I need you present." He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. Dr. Raymond Holloway came through the door at 11:22. He was a tall man, 51, with the calm efficiency of someone who performed high-stakes procedures regularly and had learned that calm was not a performance but a professional responsibility. He shook Laura's hand, checked Ethan's chart, asked 3 precise questions about how Ethan was feeling and whether there had been any changes in sensation in his legs since the last assessment. "Same," Ethan said. "Good," Holloway said. "Same as what we want going into this morning." He looked at both of them. "We're going to take good care of him. The team is ready. We've done this procedure 43 times. The new approach we're using on Ethan is the one I believe gives him the best outcome." "Best realistic outcome," Ethan said. Holloway looked at him directly. "I don't traffic in unrealistic ones," he said. Best realistic outcome is that you walk out of here in 6 weeks with 70 to 80% of normal mobility restored. That you stop waking up at 3 in the morning because the pain broke through whatever you took at midnight. That you go back to doing the things you stopped being able to do. The room was quiet. That's what I'm aiming for, Holloway said. That's what the procedure is designed to deliver. Ethan nodded once. Let's do it, he said. The orderlies arrived at 11:30 to take Ethan to pre-op. Laura walked beside the bed as far as the OR corridor door, which was as far as she could go, and she held Ethan's hand until the door required her to let go. And when she let go, she watched his face, which was turned toward her, and she held his gaze until the door closed between them. Then she stood in the hallway by herself for a moment. She breathed very carefully. Then she turned around and went back to room 214 to wait. Outside St. Vincent's Medical Center, the motorcycles were arriving. Not the full 273 some riders had dispersed after the courthouse going home, or to work, or simply riding, because that was what you did when you needed to process something large. But enough had followed. 40, then 60, then a little over 80 by noon, pulling into the hospital parking lot, in the street outside in the quiet, organized way that had characterized the morning's gathering at the federal building. They were not asked to leave. The hospital security staff watching from inside made the collective decision, apparently without a formal meeting, apparently by some kind of mutual understanding, that 273 motorcycles at the courthouse and now 80 at the hospital, all of them peaceful, all of them controlled, was not a situation that required intervention. It was a situation that required observation. So they observed. Marcus Reynolds sat in the hospital waiting area on the second floor. He had not asked anyone's permission to be there. He had simply walked in, found a chair in the corner near the window, and settled into the particular quality of stillness he had spent decades developing the ability to be present in a space without requiring anything from it, without generating friction, without making himself a problem that required solving. Several nurses passed him over the course of the first hour without more than a glance. One of them, a young man named Theo, maybe 28, who had a direct and curious quality that Marcus recognized as the mark of someone who asked the questions other people considered impolite, stopped and said, "Are you here for the Walker surgery?" "Yes," Marcus said. "Are you family?" Theo asked. Marcus considered the question seriously. "Yes," he said. Theo nodded as though this was the answer he'd expected and went on his way. Daniel Whitmore spent the hour between 10:45 and 11:45 in his car in the parking garage beneath the federal building. He had told David he needed a few minutes. David had looked at him with the expression of someone who understood that a few minutes meant something more significant than that, and had gone back upstairs without comment. Whitmore sat in his car and thought. He was not thinking about Laura Walker exactly. He was thinking about the machinery of what had just happened, the sequence of decisions that had brought him to this parking garage on a Monday morning, sitting in his car after withdrawing a prosecution that he had believed as recently as Sunday night was going to be the defining moment of his campaign. The defining moment. That phrase had come from Phil Greer. Phil had come to him 8 months ago with the general idea not specific to Laura Walker, not specific to the Walkers at all initially, but a concept, a visible prosecution involving organized crime financing that would give Whitmore's campaign a tangible law and order credential before the primary. Something with a headline. Something with a recognizable name. Whitmore had not asked specifically how Phil Greer planned to find that case. He had not asked specifically where the referral for the Walker investigation had originated. He had not asked specifically why the timing was what it was. He had not asked those questions because he had not wanted to know the answers to them. He had understood at some level he never examined directly that there were things about the mechanics of how this case had come to him that he was better off not examining too closely. That was not a defense. He knew that. He was a prosecutor. He understood the law better than almost anyone who might eventually examine his conduct. He understood exactly what deliberately avoiding knowledge of material facts looked like in a legal and ethical framework. He sat in his car and looked at his hands on the steering wheel. His phone had been ringing since he came downstairs. Phil Greer had called 4 times. He had not answered any of them. He thought about the referral for an ethics review that Judge Castillo had mentioned. He thought about Phil Greer calling 4 times. He thought about Kevin Marshall and the $250 donation. He thought about 80 motorcycles in a hospital parking lot and a woman who had spent 14 months raising money for her husband's surgery. He picked up his phone. He did not call Phil Greer. He called the State Bar's ethics line. He sat there for a moment with the phone in his hand looking at the number. Then he dialed. When someone answered, he said, "My name is Daniel Whitmore. I'm a prosecutor. I need to report a potential ethical violation in a case I was handling. I believe I need to disclose the full circumstances." The voice on the other end said, "Can you tell me the case number?" Whitmore gave it. There was a pause while the person on the other end typed something. "Okay," they said. "Can you walk me through what happened from the beginning?" Whitmore looked at the concrete wall of the parking garage. "Yes," he said, and he started talking. Laura had been sitting in room 214 for 40 minutes when Donna Reeves came through the door. Donna was 58, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something that looked, depending on context, either formidable or deeply kind. She had been writing for 30 years and had known Laura for 6 of them, and she walked into room 214 and sat down in the chair nearest Laura and said nothing for a moment. "How long has he been in?" Donna said. "About 45 minutes, Laura said. "Holloway's good," Donna said. "I know. Really good," Donna said. "My nephew had a procedure with him 2 years ago. Different thing, but he's careful. He doesn't rush." "I know," Laura said again. Donna looked at her for a moment. "You should eat something," she said. "I'm not hungry." "That's not what I asked," Donna said. She reached into the bag she was carrying and pulled out a wrapped sandwich and a bottle of water and set them on the table beside Laura with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who understood that caring for people sometimes meant caring for them whether or not they cooperated. Laura looked at the sandwich. "When did you—" "There's a deli 2 blocks from the courthouse," Donna said. "I stopped on the way." Laura picked up the sandwich. She wasn't hungry, but she ate because Donna was right, and also because the act of eating was one of the ways you told your body that it was still in normal life, that this was a day that had ordinary requirements as well as extraordinary ones. "Tell me something," Laura said between bites. "What?" "When Marcus called you Sunday night, what did you think?" Donna leaned back in her chair. "I thought he wouldn't have called if it wasn't real," she said. "Marcus doesn't make that kind of call lightly. He's not a man who raises alarms unless there's a fire." "What did he say specifically?" "He said Laura Walker was arrested and her husband's surgery fund was frozen, and the surgery was Monday morning." Donna paused. "And he said she sent the signal." Laura was quiet. "That's all he needed to say," Donna said. "Honestly, the signal was all he needed to say. Everything else was detail." "Why?" Laura asked, not challenging, genuinely asking as someone who wanted to understand what that signal had meant to the people who received it. Donna thought about it. "Because it meant she was in real trouble," Donna said. "Not I have a problem trouble, real trouble. And because Ethan taught her that signal, and we all know where Ethan learned it, and what it means when someone uses it, is that they trust the people who will receive it enough to ask for the real kind of help." She paused. "You don't send that signal to people you're not sure of. You send it to people you know are going to show up." Laura set down the sandwich. "I wasn't sure it would reach anyone," she said quietly. "I didn't know if Ethan saw it clearly enough. I didn't know if Marcus would see the video. It was the only thing I could do in that moment. So I did it." "That's usually how it works," Donna said. "You do what you can do," Laura said. "And then you trust the people you've spent years building trust with," Donna said. "Which you had. Which is why 273 people got in their cars and on their bikes and drove to Bridgeport on a Monday morning." Laura looked at the window. "I keep thinking," she said, "about the people who weren't there. The people who needed help from the fund and got it. They don't know any of this happened. The veteran in New Haven whose medical equipment we paid for. The family in Fairfield whose eviction we helped stop. They have no idea that someone tried to use the money that helped them as a weapon." "Would you want them to know?" Donna asked. Laura thought about it. "No," she said. "I'd want them to just have had the help. That's the whole point. The help shouldn't come with strings. It shouldn't come with the requirement that you now know about the people who provided it and feel obligated." "Then that's how it worked," Donna said simply. They sat together for a while after that without speaking, in the particular comfortable quiet of people who have known each other long enough That silence between them is not absence, but presence. Marcus Reynolds received a call at 12:40 that he did not expect. The number on his screen was one he didn't recognize, but he answered it with the same readiness he'd been bringing to his phone all morning. "Mr. Reynolds," said the voice. It was male professional, slightly guarded. "Yes," Marcus said. "My name is David Kang. I'm Daniel Whitmore's assistant." Marcus said nothing. "I know this is unusual," David said. "I know why you'd hang up. I'm asking you not to." Marcus still said nothing, which was its own kind of response. "Mr. Whitmore is not going to pursue any further action against Mrs. Walker," David said. "The charges are dismissed, and they're staying dismissed. I want you to know that." "I know that," Marcus said. "It happened 2 hours ago." "Right," David said. Yes." A pause. "Mr. Whitmore asked me to pass on that he's filed a disclosure with the state bar, voluntarily, regarding the circumstances of how the Walker case came to him." Marcus was very still. "He told them about Greer," Marcus said, a longer pause. "He told them everything," David said quietly. Marcus absorbed that. "Why are you calling me?" he said. "Because," David said, and now there was something different in his voice, not the professional guardedness, but something more personal. The voice of someone who had been deciding for a while whether to say what he was about to say. "I've been working for Daniel for 3 years, and I knew something was wrong with this case. I knew it from the beginning. The timing was too convenient. The referral was too clean. And I didn't say anything, and I should have, He stopped. Marcus waited. "I'm sorry," David said. "I know that's not worth much to Mrs. Walker." Marcus looked at the wall of the waiting room. "Son," he said, and his voice had the particular quality of someone who had spent a long time watching young people make the calculations that shaped who they became. "The apology matters, not because it fixes what happened, but because the person you decide to be after you make a mistake matters more than the mistake." Silence on the other end. "What are you going to do?" Marcus said. "I don't know yet," David said honestly. "That's a good answer," Marcus said. "The people who know exactly what they're going to do right after they've done something wrong are usually the most dangerous ones." David exhaled. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," Marcus said. "Thank the 273 people who showed up this morning and made it impossible for your boss to bury this. They're the reason you're having this conversation instead of a different one." He hung up. He sat for a moment. Then he looked at his phone and typed a brief message to Sandra Cho. "Whitmore filed a voluntary ethics disclosure with the state bar. His assistant just called me." Sandra's reply came back in under a minute. "I know. They called me 20 minutes ago. Building the Phil Greer case now." Marcus put his phone their way and looked at the waiting room door. Somewhere behind that door in an operating theater on a different floor, Raymond Holloway and his team were working on Ethan Walker's Spain with the focused precision of people who understood that what they were doing had consequences that extended far beyond the body on the table. Marcus was not a religious man in any conventional sense, but he believed with the kind of conviction that comes from decades of watching what actually happened in the world, as opposed to what people said would happen, that some things were meant to work out. Not in a cosmic or predetermined way, not because the universe arranged itself around justice, but because sometimes the right people showed up at the right time, and the machinery that was supposed to destroy something good ran into the simple, immovable fact of people who refused to let it. He sat and he waited. The call that Sandra had been building toward since that morning came at 1:15. She had been in a borrowed conference room in the federal building for the last 2 hours working through the documentary records she was assembling on the connection between Phil Greer, Kevin Marshall, and the timing of the Walker investigation. And she had been doing it with the focused intensity of someone who understood that what she was building was not just a defense of her client that work was done, but an offense, a counterclaim. Because what had been done to Laura Walker was not just a prosecutorial overreach that happened to collapse under examination. It was a calculated act. Someone had looked at a woman who was fighting a development project that stood to make several people a great deal of money and had identified the thing most likely to neutralize her. And the thing most likely to neutralize her was not attacking her directly, but attacking the trust people placed in her by transforming the charitable fund she managed into evidence of a crime. That was targeted. That was deliberate. That was a level of malice that deserved consequences proportional to its sophistication. Sandra had spent the morning building those consequences. At 1:15, she had enough. She made the call to the FBI's Economic Crimes Unit. The agent who answered was a woman named Torres, who Sandra had worked with 3 years ago on an unrelated matter, and who had the quality Sandra most valued in federal investigators, which was that she did not require the full architecture of a case to be explained to her before she could begin processing what she was being told. She could hear 3 facts and understand what the 4th was going to be. Sandra gave her the facts. Torres was quiet for a moment. The development connection, Torres said. Do you have the Hartwell Group's acquisition timeline documented? I have their public filings, Sandra said. I need someone with subpoena authority to get their internal communications. Give me the case number and what you have on Marshall and Greer, Torres said. I'll make some calls. How long? Sandra asked. If what you're describing is what you're describing, Torres said. Not long. This kind of thing moves fast once we have the thread. I know, Sandra said. Pull it, Shim. Phil Greer had stopped calling Whitmore by noon. He had sent 4 texts between 9 and 11, each one escalating in tone from concerned to urgent to something that read in the clipped, compressed language of someone who was genuinely afraid, as close to panicked as Greer apparently permitted himself in writing. The last text said, "Call me, we need to talk before this gets worse." Greer did not know when he sent that text that worse was already in motion in a direction he hadn't anticipated. He was at his office in New Haven, in the building where his political consulting firm operated out of a suite on the 4th floor. He was on his 2nd cup of coffee and his 3rd calculation of how bad this could get when his assistant put her head through the door and said, "There are 2 people here to see you. They say they're from the FBI." Greer looked at his assistant. "Tell them I'll be right out," he said. He sat for a moment after she closed the door. He thought about Kevin Marshall. He thought about the bar in Waterbury. He thought about the conversation he had had with Kevin 3 weeks ago, which had seemed at the time like a straightforward arrangement between 2 people with aligned interests and sufficient discretion. He thought about the fact that someone had apparently been within earshot of that conversation. He picked up his phone. He thought about calling a lawyer. He put the phone down. He stood up. He walked out of his office to meet the people from the FBI. He had made a calculation on the way down the hallway that turned out to be one of the worst calculations of his career. He decided that if he cooperated openly, if he framed his own role as advisory rather than directive, if he let Kevin Marshall take the primary weight of what had been done, he could manage this. He could not manage this. He did not yet know that, but he was about to find out. Sherry. At 2:47, Dr. Raymond Holloway walked through the doors of the OR corridor and into the 2nd floor hallway where Laura Walker had been sitting for the last 3 hours. Laura stood up the moment she saw him. Donna stood up beside her. Marcus Reynolds from his corner of the waiting room looked up without moving. Holloway walked toward Laura with the expression of a man who had something to say and had decided before he opened his mouth exactly how he was going to say it. "The procedure went very well," he said. Laura's hand went to her mouth. "Better than very well," Holloway said. "We got full decompression of the affected nerve roots. Better access than the imaging suggested. The structural repair is solid. His body responded well to the anesthesia, and there were no complications." Laura's eyes were wet. "Is he?" she started. "He's in recovery," Holloway said. "He's going to be groggy for a few hours. You can see him in about 30 minutes. "The mobility," Laura said. "The outcome you projected, based on what I saw in there," Holloway said. "I'm revising my estimate upward." Laura stared at him. "Upward," she said. "The nerve root damage was less extensive than the imaging indicated," Holloway said. "We had better access. I think we're looking at closer to 85, maybe 90% restoration over the course of his recovery. Not 6 weeks, probably 12 to 16, but closer to full function than I initially believed possible." The waiting room was very quiet. Laura pressed both hands over her mouth. Donna put her arm around her. From his corner, Marcus Reynolds sat forward in his chair and put his elbows on his knees and looked at his hands for a moment. And it was possible, if you were watching him closely, which Theo, the nurse, happened to be passing through the waiting room, on his way to somewhere else, to see something move across Marcus Reynolds' face that was not the stillness that usually characterized it, but something warmer and less controlled. something that looked like the expression of a man who had spent a very long night making very many phone calls and was now for the first time since Sunday exhaling. "Thank you," Laura said to Holloway, and her voice broke slightly on the second word. "Thank your team," Holloway said, and he meant the surgical team, but as he said it, he glanced briefly toward the window that looked out toward the parking lot, where the motorcycles were still there, still waiting, still present in the way they had been present since morning. Then he smiled briefly and walked back through the doors. Laura turned to Donna. Donna hugged her. It was not a careful, restrained hug. It was the kind of hug that two people who have been through something together give each other when the something is finally over, and the body wants to say what words can't quite reach. Laura let herself be held for a moment. Then she stepped back. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked toward Marcus's corner. Marcus was watching her. 85 to 90%, she said. Marcus nodded once. "Go see your husband," he said.
Jacko.
Ethan Walker was awake when Laura came into the recovery room at 3:25. Barely awake, his eyes were at half-mast, and the anesthesia was still visible in the way his face was organized loose and slow around the edges, the particular floating quality of a person who was present but not yet fully connected. But he was awake, and when Laura came through the door, his eyes came into focus. "Hey," he said. His voice was rough from the breathing tube. "Hey," she said. She sat down beside him and took his hand, and his fingers curled around hers with more strength than she expected. "Holloway came to see me," he said, "before you." "I know," she said. "He told me." 85 to 90, Ethan said. The words came out slowly with the careful quality of someone checking that they remembered correctly. 85 to 90, Laura confirmed. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, they were wet. Not crying, not yet, just the particular brightness of someone who has been holding a fear for a very long time and has just been given permission to put it down. 4 years, he said. "I know," she said. 4 years of this, he said. "I know," she said again. "And you never," he stopped. "What? You never stopped," he said. "Not once. I told you twice to stop fighting the insurance and you didn't. I told you once that maybe this was just how things were going to be, and you looked at me like I'd suggested something genuinely insane." "You had suggested something genuinely insane," Laura said. He laughed, a small, rough sound, more breath than voice. "Yeah," he said. "You would have done the same for me," she said. "I would have tried," he said. "I don't know if I would have done it as well." "You would have," she said. They were quiet for a moment. "Marcus," he said. "In the waiting room," she said. "He's been here since this morning." Ethan was quiet. "I need to talk to him," he said. "You need to sleep," she said. "Laura." "Sleep first," she said. "Talk to Marcus when you don't sound like someone who just had major surgery." He looked at her for a moment. "You're going to be a difficult person to recover with," he said. "I am a nurse," she said. "That is literally my job." He closed his eyes again. His grip on her hand did not loosen. She sat there and watched his breathing, slow and even, out into real sleep, and she thought about everything that had been required to reach this particular moment, not just the last 72 hours, not just the arrest and the hearing and the courtroom and the parking lot conversation and Sandra's case and Carl Brixton's testimony, but the 14 months before that, the 7 years before that, the entire architecture of relationships and trust and quiet, persistent work that had made it possible for a signal from a hospital hallway to move 273 people. She thought about all of it, and she thought we almost didn't make it. That was the thing you couldn't forget, that underneath the outcome, the surgery, the 90%, the charges dismissed, the ethics referral, the FBI arriving at Phil Greer's office, underneath all of it, was the narrowness of the margin by which things had gone right instead of wrong. If Carl Brixton hadn't been at that particular bar, if the video hadn't been posted, if Marcus hadn't watched it 3 times and noticed the signal, if Sandra hadn't had the contact at the financial crimes unit, if Whitmore at the end hadn't made the decision he made, any one of those threads pulled differently and the whole thing collapsed. That was not a comfortable thought, but it was an honest one. And Laura Walker had always believed that honest thoughts, even uncomfortable ones, were better than comfortable fictions. She sat beside her sleeping husband and held his hand and watched him breathe and let herself, for the first time in 3 days, simply be present in a moment that wasn't threatening to fall apart. Outside in the parking lot, 80 motorcycles waited. And on the floor above in a waiting room, Marcus Reynolds finally closed his eyes for a moment. He had been awake since 5 o'clock Sunday morning. He had made 63 phone calls. He had driven across 2 state lines. He had sat in this chair for 4 hours. He was 62 years old and his back hurt, and he had not eaten since the granola bar he'd found in his jacket pocket at noon. But he sat in that chair with the particular quality of someone who had done what needed to be done and was now simply present. Not planning anything, not worrying about what came next, just here in this room, waiting for news that had already come, letting the day settle around him the way a long and difficult day eventually does when the thing you were afraid of doesn't happen. Theo the nurse walked past his corner again at 3:40. He stopped. "Surgery went well," he said to Marcus. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Marcus said. Theo nodded. "Good," he said. "That's good." He started to walk on, and then he stopped again. "Are you hungry?" he said. "There's decent food in the cafeteria, for hospital cafeteria food." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I could eat." "Come on then," Theo said. Marcus Reynolds stood up from his chair slowly with the careful movements of a large man whose body had been sitting for a long time, and he followed the young nurse down the hallway toward the elevator. And behind him, the waiting room was empty, and Ethan Walker slept. The story should have ended there. That was what Laura thought 3 days after the surgery, sitting in the chair beside Ethan's hospital bed watching him sleep through the particular deep healing sleep of a body doing serious internal work. The story should have ended with the dismissal and the surgery and the 90% and Marcus eating cafeteria food with a young nurse named Theo. That was a complete story. That was a story with a beginning and a middle and an end that meant something. But the machinery that had been set in motion on Monday morning did not stop simply because the immediate crisis was resolved. It kept moving. And what it moved toward was something none of them had planned, and several of them had not fully anticipated a reckoning that was less dramatic than the courthouse morning, but in some ways more significant because it was the kind of reckoning that happened in offices and conference rooms and legal filings rather than on courthouse steps. And that determined not just what happened to one family, but what happened to the people who had decided that one family was an acceptable target. The first sign that things were moving came from Sandra Cho, who called Laura on Tuesday evening. Laura was in the middle of changing Ethan's water pitcher, a task so ordinary that it felt almost aggressively normal after the last several days when her phone buzzed on the bedside table. Ethan, who was more awake than he looked, didn't answer it without opening his eyes. Laura picked up. "I have news," Sandra said immediately in the tone she used when the news was significant enough that preamble was a waste of time. "Kevin Marshall resigned from the Financial Crimes Unit this afternoon, effective immediately." Laura set down the water pitcher. "Resigned or was pushed," she said. "The official statement says resigned," Sandra said. "My contact at the unit says pushed is closer to accurate. The internal review of his escalation on your case turned up a documented communication between Marshall and Phil Greer going back 4 months. Not just the campaign donation, actual documented coordination." "Documented how?" Laura said. "Text messages," Sandra said. "Marshall sent Greer a text 3 weeks ago, 11 days before your arrest, that said, and I'm reading this directly, found the right pattern. Timing works for the Monday. We'll move it up the chain this week." The room was very quiet. Ethan's eyes were open now. "He told Greer about the timing of the arrest," Laura said slowly, "before it happened." "Before it happened," Sandra confirmed. "Before he escalated the referral. He coordinated with Greer on when to move so that the fund would be frozen before the surgery." Laura sat down on the edge of the bed. Ethan reached over and put his hand on her arm. "That's not just a procedural violation," Laura said. "No. Oh," Sandra said. "That's conspiracy to obstruct a medical procedure by deliberately freezing funds designated for that purpose through a fraudulent legal action. That's a federal matter. Agent Torres has the text messages. The FBI opened a formal investigation this morning." Laura looked at Ethan. He was watching her with the focused, still expression he wore when he was processing something large. "And Greer," Laura said. "Greer retained counsel yesterday afternoon," Sandra said. "A very expensive attorney from New Haven, which tells you exactly how seriously he's taking this. He's not cooperating yet. But the FBI has his communications with Marshall. They have Carl Brixton's statement. They have the Hartwell Development acquisition timeline. They have a very complete picture of what happened and why." What about Whitmore? Laura said. A brief pause. Whitmore is cooperating fully, Sandra said. He gave Torres everything he had on Greer's involvement in directing the case. He's also given a formal sworn statement to the ethics board. Another pause. He's going to lose his bar license, Laura, possibly temporarily, possibly permanently. His campaign is over, but he's cooperating, and that cooperation is going to matter for what happens to Greer and Marshall. Laura was quiet for a moment. How did this start? She said. Originally, what was Greer actually trying to do? Hartwell Development has been trying to acquire a 2-block area in the east side for 22 months, Sandra said. The chapter's property, the garage, and the meeting hall sits on one of the parcels they need. Without it, the development footprint doesn't work. Hartwell made 3 offers. The chapter declined all 3, and you organized community opposition to the project that killed 2 of their permit applications. So they needed to discredit me, Laura said. They needed to discredit the community opposition, Sandra said. You were the visible face of it. If you were arrested on financial crimes charges connected to the Hells Angels, the opposition fell apart on its own. No one was going to stand behind a woman facing federal charges. No one was going to listen to community meetings organized by someone under indictment. Laura thought about that. She thought about the families in those community meetings, the elderly residents who came because they were worried about what development would do to their rents, the small business owners who showed up because they'd heard that the development project planned to rezone the commercial area, the people who had trusted her to represent their concerns accurately and persistently. They weren't trying to destroy me, Laura said slowly. They were trying to destroy the opposition. I was just the most efficient way to do it. Yes, Sandra said. How much money is the development project worth? Laura said. The full build-out is projected at $340 million, Sandra said. Hartwell's piece of it is approximately $60 million in profit. The number sat in the air between them. Ethan said from the bed, $60 million. Yes, Sandra said. She had heard him. They tried to destroy Laura's life, Ethan said, and freeze the fund that was supposed to pay for my surgery for $60 million. Yes, Sandra said again. Ethan was quiet. He looked at the ceiling. Then he said very quietly, tell me what we can do. Right now, Sandra said, nothing. Let the FBI do their work. Let the ethics board do their work. Don't talk to media without going through me. Don't talk to Hartwell or Greer or anyone connected to them. And after right now, Ethan said. Sandra was quiet for a moment. After right now, she said, there's a civil case. Against Greer, against Marshall, potentially against Hartwell Development, directly depending on what Torres finds about their level of involvement, damages for the deliberate interference with a legitimate medical fund, damages for the false arrest, damages for the harm caused by the asset freeze. Another pause. It won't be fast, Sandra said. These things are never fast, but it will be thorough, and I intend to be very thorough. Laura looked at her husband. Okay, she said. Okay, Sandra said. Sandra, Laura said. Yeah. Thank you, for real. I'll send you a bill, Sandra said, in the dry tone that was the closest she got to warmth in professional context. Get some sleep. She hung up. Laura set the phone down and looked at Ethan for a moment. Kevin Marshall resigned, she said. I heard he said. The FBI has the text messages. I heard that too. $60 million, she said. Ethan exhaled slowly. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. What the families you helped, he said, with the fund, the people who got help from money that Greer and Hartwell were trying to label as criminal proceeds. He paused. They were going to take 14 months of genuine charitable work and make it into the thing that puts you in prison. That's not just about us. That's about every person that money helped. Laura looked at him. Yeah, she said. I want them to answer for that, Ethan said. He said it quietly without heat, which was in some ways more serious than anger would have been. Not for what they did to me, for what they tried to do to all of it. Sandra's going to make sure they do, Laura said. Morrison. Good, Ethan said. He closed his eyes again. Laura watched him for a moment. Then she picked up the water pitcher and finished what she'd been doing. Marcus Reynolds did not hear about Kevin Marshall's resignation until Wednesday morning, when Big Jim Mercer forwarded him the brief news item that had appeared in the Bridgeport Post. It was 4 lines long. It said that a financial crimes unit analyst had resigned amid an internal review. It did not mention Laura Walker by name. It did not mention Phil Greer. It did not mention the text messages or the coordination or the $60 million development project that had provided the motive. 4 lines. Marcus read it twice. Then he put his phone down and went back to what he had been doing, which was working at the garage on a '72 Sportster that a member's son had brought in with a seized engine. He had been at it since 6 that morning. Mechanical work was the thing Marcus returned to when he needed to think without thinking, when he needed his hands occupied so his mind could work on something else. His mind was working on several things. It was working on what Sandra had told him Tuesday evening when she called him with an update. It was working on the FBI investigation and what it would require from Carl Brixton, who had already given a formal statement, but who Marcus wanted to make sure understood exactly what he was committed to and whether he had support for the process ahead. It was working on the community opposition meetings that Laura had been running, which were now, with Laura's arrest having become public and the circumstances becoming known, attracting significantly more attention than they had before. And it was working on something more personal. Marcus had been writing for 40 years. He had been leading people in one capacity or another for 30 of those years. He had learned through a great deal of trial and a proportionate amount of error that the moments that tested a community were not the dramatic ones, the crises, the confrontations, the days that required everyone to show up and be visible. Those days had their own momentum. People rose to them because the need was obvious and the action was clear. The moments that actually revealed who a community was were the days after the dramatic ones, when the cameras were gone, when the crowd had dispersed, when the immediate crisis was resolved, and what remained was the quieter, longer work of dealing with the consequences and making sure that what had been fought for was actually secured. Those were the days that required something different from showing up in numbers. Those days required patience, persistence, the willingness to do work that nobody was going to applaud or photograph or share in a video that would get 11,000 views. Marcus was thinking about whether the people who had shown up on Monday were the same people who would show up for that kind of work. His phone rang. He looked at it. It was a number he didn't recognize, a different area code from Carl Brixton's, somewhere in the 203 Exchange, Connecticut. He answered. "Mr. Reynolds," said the voice. It was female, older, with the careful diction of someone who had composed what she was going to say before she dialed. "Yes," Marcus said. "My name is Eleanor Marsh. I live on Prospect Street, East Side. I've been attending the community meetings about the Hartwell Development Project." A pause. The ones Laura Walker organized. "I know who you are," Marcus said, which was not entirely true, but was true in the sense that he knew the community well enough to know the kind of person Eleanor Marsh was likely to be. "I've been reading about what happened," Eleanor said, "about what they did to Laura, about why they did it." And Marcus said, "I'm 71 years old," Eleanor said. "I've lived on Prospect Street for 38 years. I watched that neighborhood change, and I fought some of those changes, and I lost some of those fights. And I've been going to Laura's meetings for 18 months because she's the first person who's organized the opposition in a way that actually felt like it might work." "It has been working," Marcus said. "2 permit applications," Eleanor said. "Yes, but they're going to try again." With Laura under legal scrutiny, they assumed the opposition would fall apart. A pause. "It's not going to fall apart." "No," Marcus said. "I'm calling you," Eleanor said, "because I want to know whether the people who showed up on Monday are going to show up for the zoning board meeting on the 28th. Marcus put down the wrench he'd been holding. "Tell me about the 28th, he said. The Bridgeport Post ran its first full story on the Walker case on Thursday. It was written by the journalist named Renata Voss, who had called Sandra on Monday morning when the crowd was forming outside the federal building. Renata had spent 3 days reporting it, and what she produced was not the story that Daniel Whitmore had imagined when he'd looked at Laura Walker's arrest as a potential headline. It was a different kind of story entirely. It was the story of a woman who had spent 7 years building something genuine, who had documented every dollar of it with scrupulous care, who had been arrested 3 days before her husband's surgery by a prosecution that turned out to have been coordinated by a political operative working on behalf of a real estate developer. It was the story of 273 people who drove from 6 states on a Monday morning. It was the story of a man named Carl Brixton who had been in the right bar at the right time and who had decided when he saw the arrest video that he was going to say what he knew. It was the story of a financial analyst named Kevin Marshall who had taken $250 worth of campaign donation and turned it into a conspiracy that was now the subject of an FBI investigation. The story ran on the front page. By noon, it had been shared 4,700 times. By evening, it had been picked up by 3 regional television stations, 2 of which sent crews to St. Vincent's Medical Center, where a hospital spokesperson issued a brief statement confirming that the surgery had been successfully completed and that the patient was recovering well. Neither Laura nor Ethan spoke to media. Sandra had been clear about that, and they agreed. But Marcus Reynolds, standing outside the chapter's garage at 3 in the afternoon when a television crew pulled up and a reporter got out with a cameraman and a microphone, made a different decision. He looked at the crew for a moment. He thought about Eleanor Marsh in the zoning board meeting on the 28th. He thought about the 4 lines in the Bridgeport Post that hadn't mentioned Laura's name. He thought about $60 million and what $60 million made people think they could do to a woman who organized community meetings. He walked over to the crew. The reporter, young, professionally eager, with the slightly breathless quality of someone covering their first genuinely significant story, said, "Mr. Reynolds, can I ask you a few questions about Monday's events?" "Yes," Marcus said, "but I want to be specific about what I'll discuss and what I won't." "Of course," the reporter said. "I won't discuss the legal case," Marcus said. "That's in Sandra Cho's hands, and it stays there. I won't discuss the Walkers personally. That's their story to tell when they're ready to tell it." "What will you discuss?" the reporter said. Marcus looked at the camera for a moment. "I'll discuss why 273 people drove from 6 states on a Monday morning," he said, "because I think people don't understand that. They see the leather jackets and they think they know what they're looking at. I'd like to talk about what they're actually looking at." The reporter said yes immediately. The camera started rolling. "Those people came," Marcus said, "because Laura Walker spent 7 years showing up for other people. She didn't have to. She wasn't paid to. She chose to, and she did it carefully and honestly and with the complete documentation that should have made this prosecution impossible, and it still happened. It happened because someone looked at 14 months of genuine charitable work and decided it was a useful tool." He paused. "The thing I want people to understand," he said, "is that 273 people is not a large number compared to how many people benefit from what that fund actually does. There are families in this city and in New Haven and in Fairfield and in other places who received help from that money. Real help. The kind of help that meant a child didn't get evicted, or a veteran got his medical equipment, or a family made it through a winter they couldn't afford. Those families aren't here. They don't ride motorcycles. They don't know Marcus Reynolds or Ethan Walker. But the money that helped them is the money someone tried to turn into a crime." The camera was steady on him. "That's what we were there for," he said, "not because Laura Walker is one of ours. Because what was done to her was wrong. And if you let wrong things happen to people who do right things because you're not sure the person has the right look or the right name, then eventually nothing good is safe." He looked directly at the camera. "It's that simple," he said. The reporter asked 3 more questions. Marcus answered 2 of them and declined the third politely and without explanation. The crew packed up and left. Marcus went back inside. Big Jim Mercer, who had been watching from the garage doorway, said, "That was good." "It was accurate," Marcus said. "Same thing," Jim said. Marcus picked up his wrench. "Jim," he said, "do you know a woman named Eleanor Marsh, Prospect Street?" Jim thought it for a moment. 71 gray hair, sharp as a tack. "Probably," Marcus said. "Yeah, I know who she is," Jim said. "She runs the Neighborhood Watch Committee. Been fighting that development project since before Laura got involved." "There's a zoning board meeting on the 28th, Marcus said. "She thinks the opposition is going to need bodies in the room." Jim was quiet for a moment. "How many bodies?" he said. "More than 12, Marcus said. "Less than 273. Jim nodded slowly. "I'll make some calls," he said. "Don't make it a thing," Marcus said. "Just community members attending a public meeting." "That's what it is." "That's what it is," Jim agreed. Ethan Walker took his first real steps on Friday. Not his first steps since the accident. He had been ambulatory in the limited, painful way that had characterized the last 4 years. But his first steps after the surgery, with the physical therapist guiding him down the hallway of St. Vincent's 2nd floor with a walker, and the careful watching quality of someone who was trying to assess something that was too important to rush. Laura stood at the end of the hallway and watched him come toward her. It was approximately 40 feet. It took 3 minutes and 40 seconds. When Ethan reached her, he stopped. He was breathing hard. His hands on the walker were shaking slightly. He looked at her. "How does that feel?" the physical therapist, a compact, direct woman named Anna, asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He was doing what Laura recognized as the assessment she did herself after difficult procedures when she was trying to establish an honest baseline, putting aside what she hoped to feel, what she feared feeling, and asking what was actually present. "Different," he said finally. "Different how?" Anna said. "The pain," he said. He paused. "It's there, but it's different. He stopped again. "It's the right kind of pain. Does that make sense? It's not the same pain as before." Anna nodded. "That's exactly what we want," she said. "The pain you were having before was neurological pressure. This is surgical recovery. These are different things, and your body knows the difference." Ethan looked down at his feet. Then he looked up at Laura. "Again," he said. "Again," Anna said. He turned around slowly and walked back the way he had come. Laura watched him go. She was not crying. She had made a decision at some point in the last several days that she had done all the crying the situation was going to require of her, and that what she was allowed to do now was simply be present for the things she had been working toward for 14 months. But her throat was tight. And when Ethan turned around at the far end of the hallway and started back toward her again, she pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and held herself very still. He made it to her in 2 minutes and 50 seconds that time. Anna wrote something down on her clipboard. "Progress," she said simply. On Saturday, Sandra called with another update. She called Laura's cell at 9:15, which told Laura the news was significant enough that Sandra wasn't waiting for business hours. The FBI executed a search warrant at Hartwell Development Group's offices yesterday evening, Sandra said. They pulled servers, financial records, and internal communications going back 26 months. Laura sat down. "They went after Hartwell directly," she said. "Torres's team found something in Greer's communications," Sandra said. "Emails between Greer and Hartwell's vice president of acquisitions, a man named Robert Finch. The emails established that Hartwell was aware of and approved the strategy to neutralize community opposition by targeting you." "Approved," Laura said. "One email from Finch to Greer dated 6 weeks ago says, and I have the document in front of me, if the Walker woman is removed from the picture, the opposition loses its organizational center. The permit timeline works. Do what needs to be done and keep it clean." Laura was completely still. "Do what needs to be done," she repeated. "Yes," Sandra said. "He knew," Laura said. "Finch knew what Greer was going to do." The FBI's position is that Hartwell Development was at minimum aware of the plan to neutralize you through legal action, and that Finch's email constitutes approval of that plan, Sandra said. "Whether that rises to criminal conspiracy or stays in civil liability territory is something Torres's team is currently working through. But Hartwell's lawyers have been on the phone with the FBI since 6 o'clock last night." "They're trying to get ahead of it," Laura said. "They're terrified," Sandra said plainly. "A $340 million development project is worthless if the company behind it is under federal investigation. Their financing is already in question. I heard through a contact that 2 of their construction partners have paused contracts pending resolution." Laura thought about that. She thought about what it meant for a $60 million calculation to start visibly collapsing. "What does this mean for us?" she said. "Practically." "Practically," Sandra said, "it means the civil case is getting stronger every day. It also means Hartwell has every incentive to settle before this gets to a jury, because in front of a jury, do what needs to be done about a woman whose husband was 3 days from surgery is not language any jury in Connecticut is going to be charitable about." "When does that conversation happen?" Laura said. "Not yet," Sandra said. "Let Torres finish her work first. Let the criminal exposure get fully established. Then we negotiate from a position where they know exactly what they're facing." "Okay," Laura said. "How's Ethan?" Sandra said. "Walking," Laura said. A brief pause. "Good," Sandra said, and this time the word had warmth in it that went beyond the professional register. "Yeah," Laura said. The thing about the story that the Bridgeport Post ran, the thing that Renata Voss had not fully anticipated when she wrote it was that it did not stop being a story when it was published. It kept generating things. By Saturday afternoon, 3 other families had come forward to confirm that they had received help from the Walker Charitable Fund, not publicly, not with their names attached, but with signed statements given to Sandra Cho, establishing the legitimate purpose and impact of the money. A retired teacher named Harriet Bowles, 73, called the Post directly and told Renata that 2 years ago, after a fall that left her unable to work for 3 months, a check had arrived from the charitable fund that covered her electricity and heat through the winter. She had never been asked to do anything in return. She had written a thank you letter to a P.O. box and received no response. "I didn't know who sent it," Harriet told Renata. "I still don't technically, but I know it came from that fund, and I want people to know that money was real. It helped a real person." Renata published a follow-up piece on Saturday evening. It was shared 8,000 times by Sunday morning. A state senator named Patricia Huang, who represented a district that included part of the East Side, issued a statement calling for a full investigation into the relationship between Hartwell Development and public officials in the permitting process. She specifically mentioned the 2 permit applications that had been denied, the ones that Laura's community organizing had helped kill, and asked whether those denials had been followed by any contact between Hartwell representatives and the Financial Crimes Unit. The question was pointed. It was also, as Torres later told Sandra in one of their regular update calls, when they were already asking. Ethan's second full conversation with Marcus Reynolds happened on Sunday afternoon. Ethan was sitting up in bed, which was different from the last time. There was more of him present, more solidity, the anesthesia completely gone, and the recovery settling into a rhythm that Anna described as ahead of schedule in a way I want to be careful not to jinx. Marcus came in at 2 and sat in the chair, and they looked at each other for a moment. "How are you doing?" Marcus said. "Better than I thought I'd be doing 4 days out," Ethan said. "Anna has opinions about what I'm allowed to feel good about." "Sounds right," Marcus said. "She's good," Ethan said. "Reminds me of Laura, actually." Marcus smiled slightly. "How many did you actually call?" Ethan said. "Directly 22, Marcus said. "After that, it moved on its own." Ethan was quiet for a moment. 273, he said. 273, Marcus confirmed. "From 6 states. From 6 states. Ethan looked at his hands. "When I was lying here Friday night," he said, "after Laura was taken, I kept thinking about the people who wouldn't come. Not in a bitter way, just realistically. I knew Marcus would call. I knew the chapter would respond, but I was trying to build a realistic picture of the scale of it because I didn't want to be wrong in a way that was going to make it worse." "What did you estimate?" Marcus said. 50, Ethan said. "Maybe 60. Enough to make a visible statement. Enough so Laura would know she wasn't alone." 273, Marcus said again. "Yeah," Ethan said. He paused. "Marcus, there were people there I'd never met." "Yes," Marcus said. "People who came because they knew Laura's work. Not because of the club, not because of you, because of what she actually did. That's what happens," Marcus said, "when you do real work for a long time without keeping score. Eventually, the people you helped are the reason people show up for you." Ethan was quiet. "She didn't know that was what she was building," he said. "She was just doing what she thought needed to be done." "That's the only kind that counts," Marcus said. "The things you build without knowing you're building them." They sat with it for a moment. Then Ethan said, "The zoning board meeting, the 28th. Marcus looked at him carefully. "Eleanor Marsh called you," Ethan said. "She called me," Marcus confirmed. "She's been to every one of Laura's community meetings," Ethan said. "She's the one who found the procedural error in the second permit application that got it denied. She did that research herself at 71 years old on her own time because she believed in what Laura was building." "I know," Marcus said. "She's going to need people," Ethan said. "She's going to have people," Marcus said. "How many?" Ethan said. Marcus looked at him steadily. "How many does she need?" he said. Ethan thought for a moment. "The zoning boardroom holds about 90 people," he said. "If 70 of them are people who live in or near that neighborhood and have a legitimate stake in the project, the board can't ignore it." 70, Marcus said. 70 who are actually residents or connected to the community," Ethan said. "Not 70 bikers in leather jackets. That's a different message from what Laura was sending." Marcus nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "The opposition to this project was never about the club," Ethan said. It was about the neighborhood. It was about the families who are going to get priced out if this development goes through. If the club shows up at the zoning board and takes over the optics, it undermines the actual community argument. So the club supports, Marcus said. It doesn't lead. Laura's approach from the beginning, Ethan said. She teach you that, or did you figure it out yourself, Marcus said. Ethan smiled slightly. She taught me that, he said. She taught me a lot of things. Marcus nodded. I'll talk to Eleanor Marsh, he said. We'll be there if she needs us, and in the background if she doesn't. That's right, Ethan said. They were quiet for a moment. Marcus, Ethan said. Yeah. What you built over 30 years. The thing that made 273 people get in their cars at midnight and drive, we built it, Marcus said. Not me. You held it together, Ethan said. Marcus looked at him. You know what holds a thing like that together, he said. Ethan waited. The fact that it's real, Marcus said. That's all. When something is actually real, when the work is real and the care is real and the people see that it's real, it holds itself together. My job was never to build the thing. My job was to make sure we didn't drift away from what made it real. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Yeah, he said quietly. Rest, Marcus said. You have a lot of walking to do. He stood up. At the door, he stopped. Ethan, he said. Yeah. She sent the right signal, Marcus said. Mamisha. He meant it in more ways than one. Ethan understood all of them. Yeah, he said. She always does. Yeah. Laura was in the hospital cafeteria when Sandra called again at 4 on Sunday. She had been getting coffee the fourth cup of the day, which Anna had mildly commented on when she passed Laura in the hallway, prompting Laura to say she was a nurse, and understood the risks which Anna had received with the expression of someone who had heard similar logic before and remained unconvinced. She answered on the second ring. I have two things, Sandra said. One is significant and one is very significant. Which do you want first? Significant, Laura said. Daniel Whitmore's campaign manager, Phil Greer, has agreed to cooperate with the FBI investigation, Sandra said. As of this morning, he's providing full testimony on the coordination between himself, Kevin Marshall, and Robert Finch at Hartwell Development. In exchange for cooperation, Torres is considering a reduced charge structure. Laura absorbed that. He's giving them Hartwell, she said. He's giving them everything, Sandra said. Greer's lawyer clearly told him that the email record was comprehensive enough that trying to minimize his role was not going to work, and that the only viable option was full cooperation. Okay, Laura said. What's the very significant thing? Sandra paused for exactly one beat. Hartwell Development Group contacted me this morning, she said. Through their outside counsel, they want to open settlement discussions. The cafeteria was noisy around Laura Trey's conversations, the institutional hum of a large building in continuous operation. She stepped away from the coffee station. They're trying to settle the civil case, she said. Before the criminal investigation gets further along, Sandra said. Before the permit situation gets reviewed. Before the story about Finch's email gets picked up by anyone larger than the Bridgeport Post. What are they offering? Well, Laura said. They haven't offered anything yet, Sandra said. They opened the door. My response was that I would convey their interest to my client and that any settlement discussion would need to begin with a full public acknowledgement of what was done to Laura Walker and why. Laura was very still. Public acknowledgement, she said. I won't bring you a number without that condition attached, Sandra said. Not because the number isn't important, it is, and we'll get to it, but because you were arrested in a hospital hallway in front of your husband and in front of nurses and patients and a woman with a cell phone who posted the video, and 14 months of your work is labeled a criminal operation in a public legal filing. The public record needs to be corrected in a way that's equally public. Laura thought about that. She thought about Harriet Bowles and her electricity bill and the thank you letter to the P box. She thought about the families in those community meetings and what it had meant to them to see their community advocate arrested on federal charges. She thought about what it would mean for them to see the opposite. Tell them yes, she said. Tell them we'll talk. But the acknowledgement isn't a bargaining chip. It's a condition of the conversation starting. Already told them, Sandra said. Of course you did, Laura said. Get some sleep, Sandra said. Tomorrow's going to be a busy day. Laura hung up. She looked at the coffee in her hand. She thought about Ethan walking 40 feet down the hallway on Friday, hands shaking on the walker, breathing hard and turning around and doing it again. She thought about Carl Brixton standing outside Marcus's garage at 7 in the morning, leaning against his motorcycle waiting. She thought about Eleanor Marsh, 71 years old, calling Marcus Reynolds to ask about the zoning board meeting because she had decided the day after the dramatic thing to come back for the quieter and longer work. She thought about all of it. Then she went back to get the coffee. She had a husband to check on. And tomorrow, as Sandra had noted, was going to be a busy day. The settlement conversation lasted 11 days. Not 11 days of continuous negotiation, 11 days of the particular stop and start rhythm that legal settlements follow when one side is trying to determine how much damage control they need, and the other side is methodically making clear that the number they're willing to accept is significantly larger than what's being offered. Sandra Cho was very good at this. She had been good at it for 19 years, and what made her good at it was not aggression, though she could deploy aggression with surgical precision when required, but patience. The ability to sit inside a negotiation and let the other side exhaust their own positions before responding. The understanding that silence applied correctly was more powerful than argument. Hartwell's outside counsel, a firm from Hartford called Benedetti, and Gray made their first formal offer on Tuesday of the second week. Sandra called Laura with it at 7:15 in the evening. Laura was at home by then. Ethan had been discharged on Thursday of the previous week ahead of the schedule Dr. Holloway had initially projected, and Laura had spent the intervening days rebuilding the ordinary architecture of their life, while simultaneously managing the not at all ordinary process of watching her husband learn again how to move through the world in a body that was beginning to work differently than it had for 4 years. He was doing physical therapy twice a day. Anna came to the house on Tuesdays and Thursdays and put him through a progression that was calibrated to be difficult enough to produce results and careful enough not to produce setbacks. On the days Anna didn't come, Laura ran the exercises herself with the precise and slightly merciless approach of a nurse who understood that recovery required consistency more than comfort. Ethan had commented on day 3 of home PT that Laura was more demanding than Anna. Laura had said that was because Anna had other patients and Laura only had one. Ethan had said he wasn't sure that was the reassurance she intended it to be. They had been having versions of that conversation since Thursday, and it was, Laura had realized somewhere in the middle of the week the most normal they had been with each other in 4 years. Not normal before the accident, a new kind of normal one that had been built on top of everything that had happened and contained all of it the way a healed bone is stronger at the break. She was in the kitchen when Sandra called. First offer, Sandra said, $420,000. Full settlement of all civil claims. No admission of liability. Laura sat down at the kitchen table. No admission, she said. That's their position, Sandra said. They want the public acknowledgement framed as a statement of regret for the distress caused rather than an admission of wrongful conduct. That's not what we agreed to, Laura said. I know, Sandra said. I told them so, in some detail. What did they say? They said the admission language creates problems for their ongoing permit applications, Sandra said, which is true and also entirely their problem. Laura thought for a moment. What number gets us to the admission, she said. I don't think it's a number question, Sandra said. I think it's a criminal exposure question. Right now, their lawyers believe they can contain the FBI investigation to Greer and Marshall and keep Hartwell's corporate liability in a gray area. If Torres finds what I think Torres is going to find in those server records, that calculation changes. When it changes, the admission language stops being a deal breaker and starts being the least bad option. How long? Laura said. Torres told me they're working through approximately 6 weeks of internal communications between Finch and Greer, Sandra said. My estimate is 10 to 14 days before they have a clear picture. So we wait, Laura said. We decline the offer with a counter that establishes our position clearly, Sandra said, and then we wait. What's our counter? Laura said. Sandra named a number. Laura was quiet for a moment. Is that realistic? She said. Given what Finch's email says, given what Greer is telling Torres, and given the public record of what was done to you, Sandra said. Yes, it's aggressive. It's meant to be aggressive. I want them to understand what the floor of this looks like before they start thinking about ceilings. Okay, Laura said. There's one more thing, Sandra said. Tell me. The acknowledgement language, Sandra said. I've been drafting it on our end, not as a negotiating document, as the actual thing. The statement we want Hartwell to release. I want you to read it before I do anything with it. Because the words matter, and you're the one who was arrested. Send it, Laura said. The document came through while they were still on the phone. Laura put Sandra on speaker and read it. It was 3 paragraphs. It said in language that was precise without being legalistic that Hartwell Development Group had been made aware that actions taken in connection with its East Side acquisition strategy had resulted in the wrongful arrest of Laura Walker, the unlawful freezing of charitable funds designated for her husband's medical care, and significant harm to a community organization with a documented history of legitimate charitable work. It said that Hartwell Development deeply regretted these actions and their consequences. And it said that Hartwell Development acknowledged that the financial activity of the Walker Charitable Fund had at no time constituted criminal conduct of any kind. Laura read it twice. She thought about the hallway of St. Vincent's Medical Center. She thought about the handcuffs. She thought about the word laundering landing in the room where Ethan was lying in his hospital bed 3 days before surgery. She thought about 14 months of receipts and donation records and cross-referenced bank statements built with the care of someone who understood that trustworthy work required trustworthy documentation, and about someone looking at all of that careful documentation and deciding it was a useful tool for destruction. The 3rd paragraph, she said. Yes, Sandra said. The financial activity of the Walker Charitable Fund had at no time constituted criminal conduct of any kind. Laura read, I want one addition. After criminal conduct of any kind, D, and the funds raised through that activity served the legitimate charitable purposes for which they were intended. Sandra was quiet for a moment. That's good, she said. It's for the people the fund helped, Laura said. Not for me. I want it on the record that the money did what it was supposed to do. I'll add it, Sandra said. Send the counter, Laura said. Tomorrow morning, Sandra said. Laura hung up. From the other room, Ethan said, How'd it go? She walked into the room where he was sitting up on the couch, sitting not lying down, which was still new enough that it registered with his physical therapy resistance bands in his hands and his expression carefully neutral in the way it got when he was trying not to make the conversation about his pain level. They're not there yet, she said. They will be. How long, he said. Sandra says 10 to 14 days, Laura said. Depends on what the FBI finds. Ethan nodded. You okay, he said. She looked at him. I'm okay, she said. Are you doing those right? He looked at the resistance bands. Yes, he said in the tone of someone who had been asked this question several times and was managing his response with deliberate patience. Your left wrist, she said. He adjusted his grip. Better, he said. Better, she said. She sat down beside him. They didn't talk for a few minutes. The television was off. The house was quiet in the particular way it got in the evenings now. Not the quiet of before, which had been the quiet of a house where one person was in pain and both of them were carrying the weight of an uncertain future, but a different quiet. One that had room in it. Anna said I said something today, Ethan said. What? She said my neurological response in the left leg is tracking ahead of where she expected at this point in recovery, he said. She said that's meaningful. Laura looked at him. She told me that too, Laura said. You knew and you didn't tell me, he said. I was waiting to see if you'd lead with it, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Why, he said. Because you tend to minimize good news when it comes to your own recovery, she said. You've done it the whole time. Someone says something positive and you immediately contextualize it into something more cautious. I wanted to hear how you described it. And, he said, meaningful is the most optimistic I've heard you be about your own body in 4 years, she said. So I'm noting that. He was quiet. It does feel meaningful, he said. I know, she said. I don't want to say it too loudly, he said. Like if I say it out loud too much. Ethan, she said. He looked at her. Say it out loud, she said, as much as you want. That's not how healing works. He looked at his hands. The resistance bands were loose in his fingers now. My left leg is responding better than expected, he said, slowly like someone reading a sentence in a new language and paying attention to each word separately. Yes, she said. That's good, he said. That's very good, she said. He breathed. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. She reached over and straightened his grip on the resistance bands. Finish your sets, she said. He looked at her sideways. You are so much worse than Anna, he said. I love you, she said. Finish your sets. The FBI completed its review of Hartwell Development's internal communications on day 9. Torres called Sandra at 8 in the morning and Sandra called Laura at 8:15 with a voice that had a different quality from the previous calls, not the controlled professional tone that Sandra used when she was delivering information she had already processed and organized, but something sharper, more immediate. They found more than Finch's email, Sandra said. Laura stopped what she was doing. How much more? She said. Torres found a meeting memo from 14 months ago, Sandra said. An internal strategy session at Hartwell. The memo documents a discussion between Finch Hartwell's CEO, a man named Gerald Hartwell, the founder's son, and their chief legal officer. The subject of the meeting was, quote, eliminating organized resistance to the Eastside acquisition. Laura sat down very slowly. 14 months ago, she said. 14 months ago, Sandra confirmed, which is exactly when you started organizing the community meetings. Gerald Hartwell was in the room, Laura said. Gerald Hartwell ran the meeting, Sandra said. The memo is his chief legal officer's notes. It documents Gerald proposing to identify and target the individual most responsible for organizing opposition. It documents the CLO raising legal concerns. It documents Finch volunteering to handle the external coordination, meaning Greer and Gerald saying, and I want to be very precise about this language because Torres read it to me directly, handle it. I don't want to know the specifics. The kitchen was very quiet. I don't want to know the specifics, Laura repeated. Yes, Sandra said. He gave Finch permission to do whatever needed to be done, Laura said, and created explicit deniability by saying he didn't want to know. That's exactly what he did, Sandra said. And that memo combined with Greer's full cooperation, Marshall's text messages, and Finch's email closes the deniability loop. Torres is going to the U.S. Attorney's Office this afternoon. Gerald Hartwell is going to be named in the federal investigation personally. The weight of that took a moment to settle. Laura had known intellectually since the night Sandra told her about Finch's email that this went above Phil Greer and Kevin Marshall. She had known that two people of their relative seniority didn't engineer something this coordinated without someone above them knowing and approving. She had understood the architecture of it, but understanding the architecture and hearing that the man at the top of it was now personally named in a federal investigation were different things. Gerald Hartwell, she said. Yes, Sandra said, the CEO of a $340 million development project. Laura said personally authorized targeting a nurse who organized community meetings. Yes, Sandra said, because of the garage, Laura said, the chapter's garage, because they couldn't buy it. And because you made it impossible to route around the community opposition, Sandra said, you were too effective. The permit denials cost them 18 months of delay and significant financing complications. You became the problem that needed solving. Laura thought about Marcus Reynolds and the 40-year-old garage where he fixed motorcycles and organized charitable work and held together the community that had shown up on a Monday morning. She thought about what $60 million made people think they were entitled to do to other people. She thought about Gerald Hartwell saying, I don't want to know the specifics, and what kind of man sat in that meeting and said those words. Sandra, she said, yes. Call Hartwell's lawyers, Laura said. Tell them the counter is now different. Sandra was quiet for a moment. How different, she said. Laura named a number, a long pause. Laura, Sandra said. Is it realistic? Laura said. Given this morning's news, Sandra said slowly. Yes, it's realistic. It's on the high end of realistic, but it's within defensible range. And the acknowledgement language, Laura said. Gerald Hartwell signs it personally. Not Hartwell Development Group as a corporate entity. Gerald Hartwell as an individual. Another pause. Longer. That's going to be the hardest part for them, Sandra said. I know, Laura said. That's why it's the condition. Sandra was quiet. You're not doing this for the money, Sandra said. It wasn't a question. The money matters, Laura said. The fund needs rebuilding. There are families who depend on what we do. Ethan's recovery is going to cost more than we planned. The money matters. But, Sandra said, but a man who sat in a boardroom and said, handle it, I don't want to know the specifics, about a woman who organized neighborhood meetings, that man needs to put his name on a document that says what he actually did, Laura said. He needs to sign something that cannot be attributed to a corporation or a legal strategy or a communications team. He needs to be personally accountable in writing in public. A long silence. I'll call them, Sandra said. Taya. Hartwell's lawyers pushed back hard on the personal signature requirement. They pushed for 4 days. They offered various alternatives, a joint statement, a statement from Gerald Hartwell in his capacity as CEO rather than as an individual, a statement from the board of directors that included Gerald's name among others. Sandra declined all of them. On the 5th day, Torres called Sandra to inform her that the U.S. Attorney's Office had accepted the referral and that Gerald Hartwell would be receiving a target letter within the week. Sandra called Hartwell's lawyers immediately after hanging up with Torres. She did not deliver the news of the target letter. That wasn't her place, and they would learn it through their own channels soon enough. She simply said, "I want to revisit the personal signature requirement." There was a long silence on the other end. Then Hartwell's lead counsel, a man named Peter Benedetti, who had been in practice for 31 years and who had the resigned quality of someone who had just done the final calculation and arrived at an answer he didn't like, said, "What's the final number?" Sandra told him. Another silence. And the statement language, he said, "I'll send you the draft," she said. "Gerald signs personally," he said. "Gerald signs personally," she said. The silence this time was the longest one. "Give me until tomorrow morning," Benedetti said. "You have until tomorrow morning," Sandra said. She called Laura at 6 that evening. "They're going to say yes," she said. "I don't have it in writing yet, but Benedetti's voice told me everything I needed to know." "What did his voice tell you?" Laura said. "That they got the target letter," Sandra said. Laura exhaled. "When will we know for sure?" she said. "Tomorrow morning," Sandra said. "But Laura, start thinking about what you want to do after, because this is going to close." Laura looked across the room at Ethan, who was doing his evening exercises with the focused determination of a man who had decided that recovery was a job and he was going to approach it the way he approached every job, which was with complete commitment and the stubborn refusal to cut corners. "I already know what I want to do after," she said. "What's that?" Sandra said. "The same thing I was doing before," Laura said. Tahir. Peter Benedetti called Sandra at 9:17 the following morning. They spoke for 14 minutes. Sandra called Laura at 9:34. "It's done," she said. 2 words. Laura was standing in the kitchen, coffee in hand, watching Ethan move carefully across the kitchen floor. No walker today, just his own 2 feet, in the particular concentrated attention of someone who was learning to trust their body again, after years of the body being untrustworthy. "It's done," Laura repeated. "Gerald Hartwell will sign the personal statement," Sandra said. "The acknowledgement language includes your addition about the charitable purposes. The number is what you asked for. And there is one additional element that Benedetti offered this morning, which I want to tell you about before you celebrate." "Tell me," Laura said. "Hartwell Development is withdrawing the Eastside acquisition application," Sandra said. "Permanently. They're also donating the parcel they already owned in the acquisition area, 2 vacant lots on the corner of Prospect and Elm, to the city for use as community green space." The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan had stopped moving. He was looking at Laura. "They're giving up the development," Laura said. "The full project?" Sandra said. "Benedetti presented it as part of the settlement. I think Gerald Hartwell's lawyers told him that continuing to pursue a project that is now publicly associated with a federal conspiracy investigation using a company that the CEO personally named in an acknowledgement of wrongful conduct was not a viable business strategy." "The parking lots," Laura said slowly. "Prospect and Elm. That's 3 blocks from the chapter garage." "Yes," Sandra said. "Eleanor Marsh has been trying to get green space on that corner for 8 years, Laura said. "I know," Sandra said. "I looked her up after you mentioned her." Laura looked at Ethan. His face had the expression it wore when something large was happening and he was staying very still so as not to disturb it. "Sandra," Laura said. "Yeah." "You are very good at your job," Laura said. "I know," Sandra said. "I'll send the final documents for your signature by end of day." She hung up. Laura and Ethan looked at each other. "It's over," he said. "It's over," she said. He breathed slowly. "Tell me all of it," he said. She told him. When she got to the part about the lots on Prospect and Elm, he closed his eyes and said nothing for a long moment. "Eleanor Marsh," he said. 8 years, Laura said. He opened his eyes. "Does she know?" he said. "Not yet," Laura said. "Call Marcus," Ethan said. "Let him tell her. She should hear it from someone she knows." Laura looked at him. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "I've been thinking about a lot of things," he said. I have a lot of time on the couch. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. Marcus Reynolds heard the news standing outside the garage on a Tuesday morning in October. One hand on his phone and the other on the door frame, looking at nothing in particular, while Sandra's words rearranged themselves into something he understood. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The lots on Prospect and Elm." "Community green space," Laura said. "Permanently." "Eleanor's been fighting for that corner since I can remember," Marcus said. "I know," Laura said. "Ethan said you should be the one to tell her." Marcus was quiet. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I'll tell her." He hung up. He stood there for another moment. Then he walked inside, got his jacket, and drove to Prospect Street. Eleanor Marsh answered the door in a cardigan and reading glasses with the expression of someone interrupted mid-task who was not sure whether to be annoyed or hospitable. She took one look at Marcus's face. "Come in," she said. He sat at her kitchen table. He told her. Eleanor Marsh listened with the focused stillness of someone who had spent 71 years learning to hear important things clearly the first time. She did not interrupt. She did not ask questions. She listened, and when Marcus finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said without any drama in her voice at all, "The corner of Prospect and Elm." "Yes," Marcus said. "I submitted 4 proposals to the city for that corner," she said. "Over 8 years. The last one got tabled because Hartwell's acquisition application was in process, and the Planning Commission said they needed to wait." "The acquisition application is withdrawn," Marcus said. "Permanently." Eleanor looked at the table. She took off her reading glasses. She pressed her fingers to her eyes for a moment. Then she put her glasses back on and looked at Marcus Reynolds. "That girl," she said, and she meant Laura. "That girl never gave up on any of it." "No," Marcus said, "she didn't." "People like that," Eleanor said, "people who keep doing the right thing even when it costs them, you know what's remarkable about them." Marcus waited. "They don't think they're remarkable," Eleanor said. "They think they're just doing what needs to be done. That's the thing. That's what makes it real." Marcus nodded slowly. "Marcus," Eleanor said. "Yeah. The zoning board meeting," she said, "the 28th. We should still go." He looked at her. "Hartwell withdrew," he said. "Hartwell withdrew," Eleanor said. "There will be other Hartwells. There always are." She paused. "But if 90 seats are filled with people who live in this community and care about this neighborhood, the next Hartwell thinks twice before they start planning." Marcus looked at Eleanor Marsh for a long moment. "How many people can you bring?" he said. "From Prospect Street alone," she said. 22 confirmed. The Neighborhood Watch Committee has been mobilized for 3 weeks. "Then you don't need us," Marcus said. "I need you in the room," Eleanor said. "Meet in front, in the room." "We'll be there," Marcus said. The settlement documents were signed on October 19th. Gerald Hartwell's personal signature appeared at the bottom of a 3-paragraph statement that would be filed with the court and released publicly the following morning. The statement used the language Sandra had drafted, including Laura's addition about the charitable purposes of the fund. It acknowledged in the precise and unambiguous terms that Laura had required what had been done and who had been harmed. Sandra sent Laura a photograph of the signed page. Laura looked at it for a long time. She was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where she had spent so many nights in the last 14 months with spreadsheets and receipt records and the accumulated documentation of 14 months of other people's generosity being carefully and honestly managed. The table where she had cross-referenced every deposit against every donor and every withdrawal against every expense, and had built line by line and column by column the record that should have made the prosecution impossible. It had not made the prosecution impossible, but it had made the prosecution undone. She looked at Gerald Hartwell's signature. She thought about the moment in the hospital hallway, the handcuffs, the word laundering, Ethan's face at the bed rail. She thought about 72 hours in a holding room. She thought about Carl Brixton at the bar in Waterbury hearing something he wasn't supposed to hear and deciding months later to stand up and say it. She thought about Sandra on the phone at 9:17 in the morning telling her it was done. She set the phone down on the table. She breathed. Then she picked up the phone and called her sister Grace. Grace answered on the first ring the way she had been answering for the last 3 weeks, which was to say immediately and with the particular quality of someone who had their phone in their hand. "It's over," Laura said. Grace was quiet for a moment. All of it, she said. All of it, Laura said. A long pause. I'm coming, Grace said. You don't have to. I'm coming, Grace said. Not because you need me, because I want to be there. I want to see Ethan walking, and I want to sit at your table and drink your terrible coffee, and I want to see what this place looks like when things are okay. Laura smiled. The coffee isn't terrible, she said. Laura, Grace said. The coffee is terrible. I'm a nurse, Laura said. I need it strong. There's strong and there's punishing, Grace said. Yours is the second thing. Laura laughed. It was the same unguarded laugh as the one in Ethan's hospital room. After the surgery, the kind that came from somewhere real that didn't require permission or context or the right moment. Just a laugh because something was funny and she was present enough to feel it. Come Thursday, she said. Ethan has PT in the morning, but he's free in the afternoon. Thursday, Grace said. Gentlemen. The public statement ran the following morning. Renata Voss at the Bridgeport Post had it before anyone else. Sandra had given her the embargo because Renata had reported the original story honestly and had treated the people in it with the respect that real journalism required, and fairness deserved to be reciprocated. The story ran at 6 in the morning. By noon, it had been shared 22,000 times. By evening, it had been picked up nationally. The headline Renata wrote was not the headline that Daniel Whitmore had imagined when he looked at Laura Walker's arrest as an opportunity. It was a different kind of headline, entirely one that told a different story about what had happened and who the people involved actually were. Laura did not read most of the coverage. She had made a deliberate decision somewhere in the second week after the surgery that the story she was living was more important than the story being written about her, and that dividing her attention between the two was not something she was willing to do. Sandra monitored the coverage. Donna sent her the pieces she thought actually mattered. Everything else Laura let move past her. What she paid attention to was Ethan. By the third week of October, he was walking from the bedroom to the kitchen without assistance in the mornings. By the fourth week, he was walking to the end of the driveway and back twice a day as part of his PT progression. Anna charted his neurological response numbers and showed them to Laura with the expression of someone who had expected good results and was getting better ones. He's working hard, Anna said on a Thursday afternoon. He's always worked hard, Laura said. It's paying off, Anna said. I know, Laura said. On the last Sunday of October, Ethan walked to the garage. Not their garage. The chapter's garage 4 blocks away, which he had not been inside since before the surgery. He walked there slowly with the careful attention he brought to every walk, now tracking his gait, monitoring the feedback from his legs, checking whether the pain pattern was what it should be or something different. Laura walked beside him. She did not hold his arm. He hadn't needed that since the second week. But she walked beside him the way she had walked beside him, their whole marriage close enough to be present far enough to let him move. Marcus was at the garage. He looked up when they came through the door and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How's the walk over 4 blocks?" Ethan said. "About 15 minutes. How do you feel?" Marcus said. Ethan considered it honestly. "Good," he said. "Tired, but good. The right kind of tired." Marcus nodded. "Sit down," he said. Ethan sat. Marcus handed him a coffee. He handed Laura one too. He got one for himself and leaned against the workbench, and they sat for a few minutes in the quiet that the three of them had built over enough years together that it required nothing to fill it. "The zoning board meeting was good," Marcus said eventually. "I heard," Ethan said. "Eleanor called me after." 46 residents showed up, Marcus said. "Standing room. The board approved the green space designation for the Prospect and Elm lots in about 20 minutes. "Eleanor cried it," Ethan said. "Eleanor didn't cry," Marcus said. "Eleanor told the board chair that 8 years was too long and they should be embarrassed, and then she sat down." "That's Eleanor crying," Ethan said. Marcus allowed a slight smile. "Yeah," he said, "that's Eleanor crying." Laura wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "What are you going to do with this place?" she said. She meant the garage. She meant the question in the larger sense, what came next after everything that had happened for the work they did here. Marcus looked around the garage for a moment. "Same thing we've always done," he said. "The difference is the paperwork's going to be better." Laura looked at him. "Sandra sent me a template," Marcus said, "for nonprofit charitable organization documentation. Formal structure, official filing, full transparency on all fund activity. She said it won't prevent someone from trying something like this again, but it makes the attempt significantly harder and the failure significantly faster." She sent you the template, Laura said. She said it was part of her services to the chapter going forward, Marcus said. She also said she was not charging for it, which I told her was unprofessional, and she told me to stop talking. Laura felt something warm move through her. How much did all of this cost her, she said, in time? She'll send a bill, Marcus said. The settlement covers it, Laura said. Whatever it is, Sandra gets paid first. She'll argue about that, Marcus said. I know, Laura said. She's going to lose the argument. Ethan put his coffee down and looked at his hands. I want a ride, he said. Both Laura and Marcus looked at him. Not today, he said quickly. Not this month. But I want that to be where this goes. I want to ride again. Marcus looked at him for a moment. Anna says, he said. Anna says 6 months minimum, Ethan said, after the next mobility assessment. Then 6 months, Marcus said. I know, Ethan said. I'm just saying, that's where I'm going. Marcus looked at him steadily. You'll ride, he said. It was not a prediction. It was the tone of someone who was stating a fact they had already verified through means the rest of the world might not have access to. Ethan looked at him. Yeah, he said. Yeah, Marcus said. Book out. Carl Brixton came to the house in November. He came on a Saturday called First Showed Up with a bottle of something and the slightly formal quality of a man paying a visit that mattered to him and wanted to conduct it correctly. Ethan opened the door. The two men looked at each other. They had not met before, not officially. Carl had been the man at Marcus's garage, the man in the courthouse, the man who had given a sworn statement to the FBI about something he'd overheard in a bar that he hadn't known was going to become the thread that pulled everything apart. Ethan knew all of this. Carl knew that Ethan knew. Come in, Ethan said. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where so much of this story had been built and broken and rebuilt. Laura brought coffee, strong coffee, which Carl accepted without comment, whatever his private opinion might have been. I want to ask you something, Ethan said. Okay, Carl said. In the bar, Ethan said, when you heard what you heard, why didn't you say something right away? Carl thought about it honestly. Because I didn't know what I was hearing, he said. I heard two men talking about timing and a fund and a woman they called the Walker woman. I didn't know who that was. I didn't know what fund. I just knew it felt wrong. But a feeling isn't enough to make an accusation. And then, Ethan said, and then I saw the video, Carl said, the arrest, and I heard the name, and I heard her say, my husband's surgery is in 3 days. And I knew what I'd heard. Ethan looked at him. You drove from Waterbury, he said. I parked outside Marcus's garage at 7 in the morning. Carl said, yeah. You'd never met him, Ethan said. I knew who he was, Carl said. The same way you know who certain people are before you meet them. By reputation, by what you've seen them do. Ethan looked at his coffee cup. You didn't have to do any of it, he said. You could have figured it wasn't your business. Carl looked at him steadily. It was my business, he said simply. That's what I decided. You hear something that wrong and you let it go. That's a decision too, and I wasn't willing to make that one. The kitchen was quiet. Laura looked at Carl Brixton. She had been sitting across the table listening without speaking the way she sometimes did when something important was being said, and her presence was enough and words were not required. The statement you gave Torres, she said. The FBI process, how was that? Uncomfortable, Carl said directly, the way the right things often are. Are you glad you did it? She said. He didn't hesitate. Yes, he said, not because everything worked out, it might not have, but because I made the right call with what I knew when I knew it. That's all you can control. Laura looked at him. That's all you can control, she repeated. Yeah, he said. They sat together for a while after that. The conversation moved to other things, Carl's daughter who had just started college, Ethan's PT progress, the green space at Prospect and Elm, which Carl had read about and seemed genuinely glad about in the uncomplicated way of someone who was not invested in the outcome, but appreciated that it was a good one. When Carl left, Laura walked him to the door. At the threshold, he stopped. Mrs. Walker, he said, and Laura, she said. Laura, he said, what you build to fund the community work, it's worth protecting. People don't always know what they have until they almost lose it. You almost lost it. I know, she said. Don't let almost losing it make you smaller, he said. Some people, after something like this, they pull back. They protect themselves. They do less because doing less means less can be taken from them. Laura looked at him. That's not who I am, she said. I know, he said. I just wanted to say it out loud. She watched him walk to his motorcycle. She watched him pull on his helmet and start the engine and pull out of the driveway with the particular ease of someone who had been doing this for a long time and whose body understood the machine the way it understood walking. She stood on the porch for a moment after he was gone. It was a cold morning. November had come in with the sharp quality of a season that meant what it said. The trees had gone through most of their color and were settling into the clean, bare architecture of late fall. She breathed. She went inside. The charity ride happened the following spring. It was not the first one. They had been doing annual charity rides for years, going back before the accident, back to the early days when Ethan was riding and Laura was learning to trust the people she'd married into. But it was the first one after everything that had happened, and it was different in the way that things are always different after you have almost lost them. The turnout was larger than it had ever been. 312 riders. Some of them were regulars. Some of them were people who had heard about the previous September and wanted to be there for the next chapter of whatever this was. Some of them were people from communities the fund had helped over the years. Not riders, but people who had heard about the ride and wanted to come and stand in it. Eleanor Marsh came. She drove herself at 71 in a sensible sedan, and she parked and got out and walked to where Marcus Reynolds was standing, and they stood together without needing to say much, watching the riders in the crowd with the shared understanding of people who had both been working on the same thing from different angles for a long time. Laura looks good, Eleanor said. She does, Marcus said. And Ethan, Eleanor said. Marcus nodded across the crowd to where Ethan Walker was standing with a group of riders talking with the animated quality of someone for whom conversation had become easy again. Someone who was not managing pain, not conserving energy, not calculating how much of himself he could spend before he had to stop. See for yourself, Marcus said. Eleanor looked. Ethan was standing without a cane, without a walker, without the careful economy of movement that had characterized him for 4 years. He was standing the way a person stands when their body is not the thing they're thinking about. Good, Eleanor said simply. Carl Brixton arrived at 11 and found Laura near the registration table. You came, she said. You invited me, he said. I wasn't sure you'd make the drive, she said. I made a longer one in September, he said. She looked at him. How are you, she said. Good, he said. How are you? Good, she said. They stood for a moment. The statement, Carl said. When it ran, I read it 3 times. Yeah, she said. The part about the fund serving the charitable purposes for which it was intended, he said. You asked for that addition. Yes, she said. Why, he said, not challenging, genuinely curious. Laura thought about how to say it. Because the people the fund helped didn't do anything wrong, she said. Harriet Bowles, who wrote a thank you letter to a P.O. box. The veteran in New Haven. The family in Fairfield. They received help from a fund that someone tried to make into a crime. They deserved to have it on the public record that the help they received was exactly what it appeared to be. Carl nodded slowly. It's the right kind of person who thinks about that, he said. It's the right kind of thinking for anyone, she said. Ethan found her at noon. He walked to where she was standing, walked without assistance through a crowd of 300 people, and he came up beside her and she turned and looked at him, and he was smiling. Not the careful smile of a man managing something, a real one. How are your legs, she said. Tired, he said. Good tired. Anna's going to ask me about today, she said. Tell her I did exactly what she said, he said. You didn't do exactly what she said, she said. Tell her I did, he said. She looked at him sideways. He put his arm around her shoulders. They stood together and looked at the crowd riders and community members and families who had received help and people who had shown up in September and people who were there for the first time, and Eleanor Marsh in her sensible sedan and Carl Brixton on his motorcycle and Marcus Reynolds watching all of it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has spent decades building something real and is watching it be real. You know what I keep thinking about, Ethan said. What? She said. The signal, he said. In the hallway, I was so afraid I'd missed it. The agents were moving and I was trying to watch your hands. And I thought if I don't see it clearly enough, if I'm wrong about what I saw. You weren't wrong, she said. I know, he said. But in that moment, I was terrified I'd misread it. You didn't, she said. And Marcus saw the video, he said. And Marcus saw the video, she said. They were quiet for a moment. Laura, he said. Yeah. All of this, he said. He didn't gesture at anything specifically. He meant all of it, the ride, the crowd, the settlement, the statement, the green space at Prospect and Elm, the surgery, the recovery, the signal in the hallway, the 63 phone calls, the 273 motorcycles, the 11 days of negotiation, Gerald Hartwell's signature, Carl Brixton, at 7 in the morning outside a garage in Bridgeport. All of it. I know, she said. You built this, he said. She shook her head. We built this, she said. All of us. Over a long time, without knowing we were building it. That's the only kind that holds, he said. She looked at him. He had said it the way Marcus had said it. She thought about that, about how certain truths move between people who spent enough time being honest with each other until the truth belonged to all of them equally, and no one could say anymore where it had started. Yeah, she said. That's the only kind that holds. 312 riders. One woman who had been arrested for doing the right thing. One man who could walk again. One corner at Prospect and Elm that was finally becoming a park. And a fund that kept going, carefully documented, officially structured, fully transparent, doing exactly what it had always done, which was take the generosity of people who had something to give and deliver it to people who needed it, without fanfare, without politics, without requiring anything from anyone, except the simple and radical willingness to believe that the work was worth doing even when it was hard, even when it cost something, even when someone decided that doing the right thing made you a target. Because the people who did the right thing long enough and consistently enough and with enough honest documentation and enough genuine care, those people, when they needed to, could send a signal from a hospital hallway and trust that somewhere in a garage or a kitchen or a bar stool, the right person was paying attention. And the right person, when they heard it, would make the call. And the call would become 63 calls. And 63 calls would become 273 motorcycles on a Monday morning. And 273 motorcycles would become the reason a man could walk beside his wife at a charity ride in the spring without a cane and without a walker, in a body that had been given back to him by the same community that had refused to let the people trying to destroy his wife get away with it. That was not a small thing. That was not luck. That was what happens when people spend years being exactly who they say they are, when the work is real and the care is real and the trust is real, and the world, which usually doesn't notice, finally has to. Some stories end with justice arriving in a courtroom. Some stories end with a signature on a legal document. This one ends with a man walking across a parking lot in the spring sunshine arm around the woman who never gave up on him, surrounded by 312 people who prove that the size of a community is not measured by its numbers, but by what it shows up for. And what they showed up for was each other. That is the only power that cannot be bought, cannot be frozen, cannot be arrested in a hospital hallway, and cannot be made into anything other than exactly what it is: real.